trying to do, and where you'll probably see her go this week, is use that threat to democracy to really be talking about abortion rights, which will help her more, and try to put it together under this freedom rubric, where you can really focus on getting out suburban married women and some other potential swing voters, that not just motivate them, but get them out. And the abortion rights is good for turnout, and the threat to democracy is something that's sort of a pitch to persuadable voters. But they both are an argument that, oh, you might support me, but you really have to turn out because democracy's on the line and abortion rights is on the line.
I'm struck by the economic calendar this week. I know you're on the political team, but our colleagues across the room are going to be churning out some really important data this week that will help to fulfill, I guess, for some undecided voters, maybe a closing argument in their minds when it comes to the economy. That jobs report will be the finale on Friday. It is expected, by the way, to show a downturn here, and I wonder how that colors the final throes of the campaign, if at all, Mike.
So my sense, and it's sort of a conventional view by people who are involved in political strategy, is that usually by now people's perceptions of the economy are pretty well formed, particularly in how it might have affected their communities and themselves. That said, you know, if you have some of these numbers, likely the GDP number, which is, you know, the overall growth in the economy, will come in pretty strong, and the inflation numbers will basically show inflation to be a lot lower than people perceive it to be, and the jobs numbers will be strong, even if not as strong as before. So all of those things might help a teeny bit, but I think they probably matter less than, you know, the perceptions people have cemented over the last few months. And what's more important is whether Kamala Harris can give people a sense of where she's taking the economy. She's been trying to do that, but that's a tougher thing for her to do because she's trying to separate herself a little from Biden, and unlike Trump, she doesn't have a 4-year record.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, thank you so much for joining us as we consider the records here. We could talk about records of another kind with our next guest, potentially, Joe, because number 24 is joining us now, I'm pleased to say, from our world headquarters in New York, former New York Knicks player, Olympic gold medalist, once a candidate for president himself, and of course, multiple-term Democratic senator from New Jersey. Bill Bradley is with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Sir, welcome to Balance of Power. We appreciate you joining us. As Joe said just a few moments ago, you've spent a good deal of time in Madison Square Garden, likely more than Donald Trump. What was your reaction to what we saw take place there yesterday?
I thought it was a sad night for Madison Square Garden. It was a kind of desecration of a place that is, in my view, the home of champions. And that was not championship action last night. I think of the values that we demonstrated as a team when the Knicks, when we won 2 world championships, things like courage, discipline, respect, responsibility, unselfishness. And none of that was displayed last night at all. To the contrary, often it was the opposite. And here I have on my lapel a number 19, and that is the number of Willis Reed, who was our star center, who sacrificed his career to come out in the 7th game in 1970 when we won the World Championship for the first time. So last night was a sad night for the Garden, and it reflected none of the values that I came to learn as a kid growing up. And I think thousands of millions of people in sports learn certain things that are reflected by the accomplishment and championships in Madison Square Garden. And Donald Trump doesn't reflect those things. Let's just take one example. When you're a kid growing up, what do your coaches tell you? Well, if you lose, you congratulate the opponent. And Donald Trump has never done that. Last night, it was a kind of half-hearted slip. And the reality is that those values are the key to a lot of people's lives, some of whom actually vote for Trump. And I'm saying he does not reflect those values. And we have to come to terms with that. And I hope that will mean that people will look at this and say Kamala Harris has the set of values that we care about.
Well, of course, Senator, and thank you again for joining us today. We hear some off-color remarks sometimes in the locker room or at games, but what we heard last night was on stage. It was into a microphone, and people were standing and cheering. I didn't hear any booing when I heard some of the more off-color jokes coming from the comedians and some of the others who were speaking before Donald Trump. And it does make you wonder about this change in the tenor in politics. Is this just the say it out loud campaign?
Well, I think that it shows that there is a dramatic decrease in the level of respect people have for each other, and certainly opponents have for each other. And I thought that last night was a new low in that regard. I mean, when we were champions in that arena, we were a diverse group of Americans from all over the country, different races, and we came together because of our unselfishness and our commitment to be the best we could be. Those are the values that I think people learn, and those are the values that I think are not reflected in Donald Trump. He's never played a sport. He doesn't understand what it is to be a champion, and therefore he spews all this hatred and all this division every day, not realizing that it's actually contrary to achieving what a president has to achieve, which is bring people together and take them to higher ground.
Well, Senator, he may not be a champion in any kind of sports arena or area, but he does know what it's like to be the victor in a presidential election. He did win in 2016, didn't last time. There is a chance he wins this time around. This is still a race that is neck and neck. What's your real view of what could happen when the results come in?
I think it's a very close race. I think 7 states will decide it. I think turnout is absolutely key. I mean, for example, in Wisconsin and North Carolina, there are like 400,000 people who have not registered, or if they registered, they've got to turn them out. They're Democrats, all of them. There are like 385,000 people in Pennsylvania and Michigan in the same category. And the question is, if Democrats can turn the vote out, Kamala Harris will be the next president of the United States. And I think that all of these actions in the last week, particularly the extremes that Donald Trump has taken his rhetoric, only will produce more turnout for Democrats.
We waited a long time for that 2000 race to be called, Bill Bradley. How long will we wait for this one?
We didn't wait that long. I hope it's called on election night, but I have to be realistic and say maybe it's a week later. I think the key thing is just how many people are outraged and come out and vote. And it's on both sides. I mean, who has the greatest emotional pitch going forward? What kind of country do we want to have? Do we want a country that takes everybody to higher economic ground where everybody has a chance? Or do we want to have a country that is divisive and a country that feeds the wealthy the bulk of the benefits? And to my view, it's a pretty clear case. If people hear Kamala Harris's program, they prefer it over Donald Trump's program. But the question is, will people actually hear it?
Well, and will she say it enough times, Senator? She's focused a lot of her closing messages on issues of democracy, the threat Trump poses, reproductive rights, for example. Does she need to spend more of the next 8 days talking about the economy specifically?
Well, I think that it wouldn't hurt to have her make a talk about taking more people to higher economic ground and drawing the contrast. But I know in closing days, they already have a strategy and it's laid out, and she's saying important things, very important things. And I think the whole issue of reproductive rights could very well be a dramatic move. But the other day, she made a speech in Houston, Texas that nobody really covered. I happened to watch the whole speech. It was a very powerful speech on what would we be like as a country where women did not have access to the possibility of abortion. And it would be a quite different place for women. And I agree, for men too.
Michelle Obama spoke at that address, arguably one of the most effective surrogates that Kamala Harris has on the trail, and they've been holding her, I guess, as the secret weapon for the 11th hour here. What do you make of the use of celebrity, whether it's Beyonce, who was at that rally, Bruce Springsteen a couple of nights before, Donald Trump showed up with Hulk Hogan last night? Does anybody care about this stuff? Does it actually mobilize an undecided voter to go to a poll next week?
Well, I mean, I might, maybe this shows my age or my sport or what. I don't think people care about Hulk Hogan, right? But I think Bruce Springsteen, he's a great New Jerseyan. He's got a voice. Why shouldn't he have a chance to express it? Beyonce? Celebrities are just people. They're not giants. And they're people who have children and families, and they want to have a country that moves forward. And those who spoke for Kamala are people who want to have everybody to go to higher economic ground. That's the economic message of the Democratic Party, has always been and can be now, and that's what you heard many of them saying over the week. The fact that they're celebrities doesn't bother me. And I think that if they draw a few more people to listen to what Kamala has to say, that's fine.
Or maybe a few more people to donate. Harris's campaign has raised more than $1 billion just since she became the candidate. And I know, Sarah, you have been working with Issue 1, which is looking at dark money in politics, the money that surrounds our presidential and democratic system. Are you concerned by how much has been raised and spent? Should it be this way?
No, it should not be this way. I mean, back in the dark ages when I ran for president, one of the issues I talked a lot about was campaign finance reform. You have to take money out of politics or you're always going to have problems. And this campaign on both sides demonstrates once again that the amount of money will come with a price at some point. And I think a lot of the Democratic money comes from people who are idealistic and who want to see certain things happen in the country to make America a better place. And that's fine. Those are the rules. We play by the rules. But if we're looking at the health of our democracy, we dramatically need to have campaign finance reform.
It's great to have you, Bill Bradley. Come see us again. Former Democratic Senator from New Jersey, of course, former presidential candidate and Basketball Hall of Famer. 24 hanging in the rafters at Madison Square Garden as we recover from an interesting night on the trail. With Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are higher at the start of this busiest week for corporate earnings. Traders also gearing up for the election and some key economic data that's going to set the stage for the next Federal Reserve decision. All major groups in the S&P 500 advanced, with the exception of energy shares that joined a plunge in oil. Airlines rallied, and shares of cryptocurrency companies surged, with Bitcoin extending its October gains. Bitcoin up right now 1.7% rather. We check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 24 points, NASDAQ up 99 points, and the Dow up 292 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.29%, the 2-year yield at 4.15%. NYMEX crude oil is down 5.75% now at $67.65 a barrel. A Bloomberg Markets Live Pulse survey finds most people believe a Trump election victory would help stocks, while a Harris victory would bring some relief to housing costs. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we cast our eyes toward the campaign trail today. Kamala Harris in Michigan ahead of her appearance here in D.C. tomorrow, in which she'll give a closing argument speech on the National Mall. And Donald Trump today is in Georgia after his rally at Madison Square Garden in New York last night. And of course, while a lot of the headlines captured what other speakers said last night, whether it was off-color jokes about Puerto Rico from a comedian or descriptions, improper ones, of Kamala Harris's racial identity from others like Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump himself did speak and in part doubled down on some of his rhetoric we've already seen on the campaign trail, including saying this on the enemy within.
When I say the enemy from within, the other side goes crazy, becomes a sound. Oh, how can he say? No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. But this is who we're fighting. These are the people who are doing such harm to our country with their open border policies.
That was after a 5-hour lead-in at Madison Square Garden. And indeed, people do go crazy over this enemy within line. And it might, in fact, be the closing argument if you try to crystallize this on a bumper sticker. Let's assemble our political panel. They're back with us together today, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. She is Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. He is Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Rick, your thoughts on this presentation last evening as we head for, as Kaylee mentioned, some interesting optics for Kamala Harris tomorrow. Is going to be talking about freedom here on the National Mall, recalling January 6th. You have posited more than once that both of these are misguided. Now that we've got one down, how do you feel?
Well, she's closing on this regardless. It would be nice at least the third leg of the stool be on the economy, because I do think that they have a story to tell, but they've just chosen really not to engage in that. Really matching, sort of talk about future tax cuts with whatever the Trump campaign's doing. So, look, I mean, there's no question that January 6th is a compelling argument to make to certain voters. And in so much as she's focused in on suburban women in the targeted states that might have some residents there, certainly does on the abortion issue. But she is not doing much to try and hold down Donald Trump's expansion in the urban environment with young Latino, Black, and non-college educated white males. And that is the real big vulnerability she's got within her base. And her efforts to try and hold back Trump's growth in the rural areas with non-college white men especially has kind of petered out. We don't hear that anymore. She's been doing tours through the rural areas, but she stopped doing that. So we'll see where this lands. But if she doesn't win this election, I think a lot of people are going to be second guessing the lack of economic message in her closing.
Well, so Jeannie, how much time should she spend on the economy tomorrow? And frankly, should she talk about any policy ideas that she hasn't already articulated, or is it too late for that kind of thing to resonate, knowing Donald Trump floated a new tax credit yesterday?
Yeah, and it's one, by the way, that Kamala Harris had put out already a few weeks ago, and she's got a big 80-page document up there touting her policies. But the reality is, this has not been an election about policy by any stretch of the imagination. So while I wish it was, it hasn't been. She's going to win by talking about the issue of Donald Trump getting into office and not having any guardrails around him this time and exacting the revenge that he has promised. I mean, you played that clip at the top, and it's so important because this is not about what anybody but Donald Trump says and what he has promised he will do. On Friday, he wrote very clearly, I will imprison the people who have come after me. He's talking about trying to kick a federal prosecutor out of the country. So we can say, oh, that's just rhetoric. She's going to have to close by saying to people, is this really what we want again? And equally importantly, talking about their attempts to limit the freedom of people in this country to do basic things like have their conversations with their doctor and have sound health care without the government saying we can't do with our bodies what we want, both men and women, by the way. So yeah, I wish there was more on the economy, but it's not gonna happen in the next few days, and it's not gonna turn this election at this point.
One of Kamala Harris's most effective surrogates, Michelle Obama, was on the campaign trail with the vice president over the course of the weekend, went to Kalamazoo, where Michelle Obama made the case against Donald Trump. Let's listen.
Let me warn you, your rage does not exist in a vacuum. If we don't get this election right, your wife, your daughter, your mother, we as women will become collateral damage to your rage.
Rick, she was speaking directly to men, as you just heard, trying to bring home the issue of reproductive rights and abortion to make this a male issue as well. Did she succeed?
Well, look, I think it's a important kind of speech to give. She's very articulate. It mirrors what her husband, Barack Obama, did in Chicago a month ago. There's an issue with young black men leaving the party and looking for greener financial pastures in the Trump era. And so unless you're talking to them about the money in their pocket and their economic futures, I think you're talking past their concerns. They are not interested in the cultural aspects of being African American. They're interested in the economic aspects of being an American. And I think that is the miss that's occurring right now. 45 million people have already voted, and they're not going to hear these messages from this point out. So they're down now to 2/3 of the vote that's going to listen in on what Kamala Harris is going to say tomorrow afternoon. And she ought to make that economic pitch to those people.
Well, so it does raise a question of timing 1 week out from a vote when in many of these battleground states, voting has already been underway for weeks. Jeannie, are we getting around to this moment a little too late for modern elections in which early voting is becoming increasingly popular, as we've seen with record numbers?
Yeah, I mean, the whole campaign has changed. I mean, 40 million, as you mentioned, people, almost 40 million have already voted. It is a missed opportunity. These campaigns try to take that into account and move their close earlier. But the fact is they've got to go down to the wire and keep getting those voters out. This is more important for the Trump campaign than even the Harris campaign, because he's trying to activate people who vote in smaller numbers than what would be traditional Kamala Harris voters. So it's a tougher hill for him to climb. But that said, I would say one interesting thing about that Michelle Obama versus Barack Obama is whereas Barack Obama was taking these young men to task, Michelle Obama took a very different tact in saying, this impacts you and the women you love as well. And again, it is not just women's bodies. It is men and women. It is liberty in general that they're talking about, not just this issue of a right to choose, although that's a really big part of this. So you've got two different messages from arguably two of the most popular Democrats out on the trail today in Barack and Michelle Obama.
It was quite a reception for Michelle Obama. Made a lot of Democrats wonder all over again. Jeannie, consider, while we're talking about closing arguments, maybe questioning them on both sides, these last couple of conversations that we've had, look to Friday and the monthly jobs report. This will be the last jobs report that comes out before the election. and it is expected to show the lowest pre-election unemployment rate in 24 years. Shouldn't that be her closing argument?
Normally, yes, it should be, but this is anything but a normal election. There is, to Rick's point, the Democrats do have very, very good economic numbers to run on, but it is not so far resonated with people. They simply do not give Joe Biden credit, or Kamala Harris by extension, for the positive aspects of the economy right now, including record historically low job numbers. So for that reason, yes, they should tout them, but it can't be the major argument they go out on here, because it's not something that we are hearing that people are voting on or feeling, or more importantly for them, giving the Democrats credit for.
Well, something people might be feeling every time they go fill up their car, Rick, is that gas prices are lower today. Oil having its biggest single-day drop since July of 2022. In part, that has to do with what happened in the Middle East over the weekend, Israel, and what seemed like a well-calibrated de-escalatory way hitting Iranian military sites. If prices at the pump continue to drop over the next week, if they're lower on Election Day, could that marginally influence the way people vote?
Sure. It's all about people's sentiment when they go into that polling place. And we still have hundreds of millions of people to vote. So it's plenty that can affect the outcome of this election that's been in a dead heat almost since it started. So absolutely, if somebody's gassing up and they say, wow, this is actually much lower price gasoline than I ever recall having, especially under Donald Trump, maybe there is a difference. But they have to hear that echoed by the administration, by Joe Biden, by Kamala Harris. If Kamala Harris is the spokesman for this administration now, why in the world isn't she talking about that today? Why in the world isn't she talking about low unemployment rates that you discussed? They do have a good news topic. And if you try to run a campaign just on the polling data, especially in a completely divided country that we are now, then you're going to skip and miss opportunities like this to take advantage of your track record. Her track record is going to be on display on the first Tuesday in November, and she needs to do everything she can to brush it up between now and then.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, always a fascinating conversation, and many thanks to both of you. Our signature panel with us today on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. They'll be back with us on the late edition of Balance of Power, of course, starting at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Around this time tomorrow, the optics are going to get interesting with Kamala Harris back here in Washington, aren't they?
Yeah, from the ellipse, of course, the very same spot in which Donald Trump spoke on January 6, 2021. That is not by coincidence. Right. I would imagine, as she tries in part to make her closing argument, as we just discussed with Rick and Jeannie, not necessarily just about policy issues like the economy, but about character, and specifically the character of Donald Trump and the threat she says he poses to American democracy. You know,
one of the things we were talking about with Bill Bradley earlier this hour is how long it's going to take to call this race when you add the counting of early ballots and some different procedures state by state. It could be days, if not weeks, Kaylee. We're going to talk about that matter coming up as well on the fastest show in politics, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 25 points, NASDAQ up 102 points, and the Dow up 312 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.28%, the 2-year yield at 4.15%. NYMEX crude oil down 5.5% or $67.70 a barrel, and Brent crude is down 5.5%. It's now at $71.84 a barrel. Shares in Google parent Alphabet and Microsoft are sharply paring their gains after the information reports that Meta is developing its own AI search engine. Alphabet shares right now less than 1% higher. Microsoft is down 0.2%. Now, the information reports that Meta, the parent company of Facebook, is attempting to lower its reliance on Google and Microsoft. Meta shares right now are up 1%. Sources tell the Wall Street Journal that Estee Lauder has chosen one of its longtime senior executives to take over as the CEO. Stéphane de la Faverie was tapped to lead the effort to revive sales. Jane Lauder, who was among the CEO candidates and granddaughter of the founder, told staff in a memo she'll step aside at the end of the year. Shares of Estee Lauder now up nearly 2%. McDonald's shares are 1.5% higher. The company putting Quarter Pounders back on the menu after ruling out the beef patties as the source for a multi-state E. coli outbreak that left one person dead and sickened dozens of others. The infections appear to be linked to the slivered onions served on Quarter Pounders, so the burgers will return to the menu without onions. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
Okay, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Watching Wall Street for us here on the fastest show in politics. This is Balance of Power, the Monday edition. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Now 8 days out from the election, and much of our conversation is morphing into what happens after the election, Kaylee. The 9-week slog, as Bruce Melman put it, between Election Day and the 6th of January, remembering this is going to take a while to call, not only the presidential campaign, the House, and all the rest, as we get a sense of what will be the balance of power here in Washington. That's what we're all about. And look at the headlines today on voting irregularities, on deep fakes, on interference. U.S. says Russians made fake video of ballots being destroyed. That was Pennsylvania, right? Late mail ballots in Mississippi ruled illegal in GOP challenge. Virginia voter purge blocked by U.S. judge ahead of election. Just a sampling of some of the stories making news today.
Well, and today we learned that Virginia is escalating that case in particular all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, or at least it has asked the justices to weigh in on whether or not it's too close to the election for this purge to happen, knowing Virginia is not the only state that has tried to do this.
Correct.
Within a 90-day window, removing people from voter rolls, perhaps without their knowledge, is something that has raised many legal questions just leading up to the vote. But as Joe says, we still have a long way to go after the vote as well in terms of litigation.
Big time. The campaigns have lawyered up, as we've reported, more than 165 lawsuits just preemptively. Wait for what will come after November 5th as we start to pick through the ballots here. There are so many questions that we have about fair elections, knowing that, as Rick Davis reminded us earlier this hour, a third of voters have already made their decisions.
Yep, millions, tens of millions have already voted. But for some, their ability to vote, it is still in question here with some of these outstanding legal issues around these voter rolls. So we want to turn to an expert now. Rebecca Caruthers is with us. She is vice president at the Fair Elections Center. Welcome to Balance of Power, Rebecca, here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's nice to have you. If we could just consider these voter roll cases that we're seeing in a number of states, Virginia included, if the Supreme Court were to actually rule in favor of Governor Youngkin of Virginia and say they can be removed from voter rolls, what potentially could be unleashed? How many people could show up to the polls on Election Day and find that they are not, in fact, still registered?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. According to the National Voter Registration Act, you cannot remove people from the election rolls within 90 days. Fair Election Center filed a lawsuit several weeks ago in Alabama, because in Alabama, there were folks who were being removed, and it turns out the court sided with us and said, absolutely, you cannot remove these people within 90 days. What you're also seeing, you're seeing a mix of misinformation and you're seeing disinformation. And just to remind both your viewers and your listeners, misinformation is when people speak out of turn, they say something that isn't entirely accurate. Sometimes it's a mistake. Disinformation is the intentional spreading of bad information targeted to certain groups. One thing that we know within the United States is our civic education is lacking. So a lot of people don't understand how the process of voting, the mechanics of voting works in this country. So unfortunately, there are bad actors from within our country and bad actors from outside of our country who are spreading bad information about our election processes.
Well, I'm glad you made that delineation, Rebecca, because this Russian fake video is getting a lot of attention here, and it should be. Intelligence officials say it was, in fact, Russian operatives behind this video purportedly showing someone tearing up ballots in Pennsylvania. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a statement about this Friday night. The Russian activity is part of Moscow's broader effort to raise unfounded questions about the integrity of the U.S. election and stoke divisions among Americans. This one got called out. How many are getting through and are actually impacting voters' minds?
You know, and what's really unfortunate is we also have some elected officials. We have some of our leaders in Florida, in Texas, in Ohio that's feeding into disinformation. We know there is lots of propaganda that has been spread across social media. We know different groups have been targeted. We know that there are certain things on Instagram that's targeting African-American or would-be Black voters in this country. We know there are things that are targeting those who are under 35, those who feel disaffected, those who are first-time voters who are trying to navigate our voting system. And what's unfortunate is when you have elected officials who ought to know better, still saying things to add to the confusion.
Well, so as we consider that with 8 days to go until Election Day and people wanting to go cast their ballot, Rebecca, what are you going to be watching for on Election Day? What perhaps frightens you about what could take place at polling centers with electoral officials if things go south?
So this is what we do know. Every presidential cycle, we have free and fair and safe elections. We have good election security in this country. I don't expect 2024 to be any different. As you mentioned at the top of the segment, almost a third of those who are likely to vote on or by November 5th have already voted. So we know that people understand that they have either voted early in person, they have voted by mail, they have voted by requesting an absentee ballot, and it was a safe process. It was a secure process. So I don't expect Election Day to be any different. We're hearing from more than over 5,000 local and state and national election officials, and we're hearing that they're ready to go, that they're excited, that people are showing up, and that the process has been relatively smooth so far. So I don't expect that to be any different on November 5th.
A lot of people don't expect to be any different than what we saw in 2020. And Donald Trump could well claim victory at 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, knowing that many early ballots will have yet to be counted. When you consider, again, as Kaylee pointed you to that evening, what is your message to our viewers and listeners on how long they should be prepared to wait?
So it depends on the state, but I would tell you this, and you're hearing it from me. I think we will know, in general, we will know on election night what's going on. Just because some states it takes several days for the election results to be certified, it doesn't mean that we still won't hear as the votes are being counted, as those totals are being announced on your local news. It's going to be business as usual. So, you know, a lot of people are going to have their eyes in Michigan. They're going to have their eyes in Pennsylvania. They're going to have their eye on North Carolina, possibly Florida, Arizona, and Nevada. But one thing I would tell the American people is familiarize yourself with the process. Understand that, understand the order of which votes are being counted. In some jurisdictions, in some states, those who early voted, those are the first numbers that you'll see at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., whatever time that your state's your state's polling locations closes. And then from there, they'll throw out the next numbers, which might be from the time that the polls open first thing in the morning until noon, and then from noon until 5. And then the post work rush hour of people rushing in to go vote. So understand the order in which votes are being counted, because one thing that we also saw in 2020 is that there was lots of misinformation saying, why are the numbers changing? Well, the numbers are changing because they're counting in real time. So I don't expect that to be any different this year.
Rebecca Carruthers. Rebecca, great to have you back with the Fair Election Center. Thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics. As we approach Bloomberg Business Week coming up about 10 minutes from now, we want to point you to an important story that hit the terminal earlier today. And with all the noise around this election and the wild weekend that we had on the campaign trail, it's something that you might not otherwise hear about. But the Pentagon is evolving. And it's evolving in the way it procures and develops new weapon systems, which we talk a lot about here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has more on this story. She's got the byline on the terminal and with us now at the table today. Tyler, welcome. You made tracks across the Potomac to sit down with the chief buyer, if I can call him that, at the Army. What'd you learn?
Right, exactly. So I was able to go to the Pentagon. I sat down with the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George. He's the highest ranking military official in the Army and also a member of the Joint Chiefs. And this was his first ever TV interview. And he was keen to sit down with us because he wanted to talk about this initiative he's trying to champion. It's called Transforming in Contact. And what the program looks to do is flood these select brigades with high-tech weapons, technology, and as fast as possible. And why it might be interesting to our Bloomberg audience is that he described it to me as a new way for the Army to do business. For a sense of what he means here, we have a cut for you to listen to about what he's trying to implement here at the Army.
There's a lot that we're trying to do right now, and probably the biggest thing is that we realize that we're going to have to buy things in the future in tranches, in smaller batches. Technology is going to continue to change, so as long as we're buying things that are modular, open system architecture, we can continue to update in our formations, and that's what we need to be able to do.
Right, so you hear him here talking about buying things in smaller batches instead of having the Army get locked into these long-term purchase orders that by the time they're fulfilled, the Army might have outdated equipment. He kept saying to me that the Army can no longer buy obsolescence, particularly when it comes to this technology. Now, this would be a much faster timeline than what the Army is used to doing. A recent Army report came out and said that on average, it takes at least 2 years for something to go through its approval, funding, regulation process just to get equipment out the door.
Okay, so this is what the Army wants, but it has to buy this stuff from somewhere. So what do the people actually making this technology have to say about this?
Right, exactly. So this idea of competition for these kind of more non-traditional companies keeps coming up. So he's really focused on cutting-edge technology. Think drones, electronic warfare, which hasn't really had the easiest time breaking into the defense industrial base. The defense industrial base has actually shrunk by about 40% in the last decade because some of the biggest defense primes have continued to consolidate. So part of this is that General George wants to invite in more smaller, non-traditional companies so they can compete. The other part of this is that he's actually letting those private sector engineers into the brigades to test this equipment alongside those soldiers. Names like Palantir, SpaceX, also Anduril. I had the chance to catch up with their chief strategy officer who told me that that part of this initiative, allowing them to go in and then actually provide this real-time feedback so then they can update those purchase orders, has really helped them out, not only to secure those purchases, but also to advance their equipment. They're billing it as good for both parts here.
Really interesting story. We've only got about a minute left, Tyler. Have we heard from the big defense contractors, the Northrops, Boeings, Lockheeds of the world on this? Is this good for them or not?
Right. So this initiative is primarily geared towards the more high-tech companies. But I will say that I heard this described as this culture change. And I asked the general about it because I spoke to many national security experts going into this story who said that he has his work cut out for him, right? Because the Pentagon is not used to doing business this way. But he says that he's trying to get everybody on board, whether that is those big defense primes and opportunities for them to contribute to this initiative in the future, or Congress, which also has oversight over how this program is working. I can tell you that so far the Army has worked with about 24 of these companies as part of this program, but it's more these non-traditional tech companies that we're seeing.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, great reporting. Thank you so much. And of course, you can find Tyler's story on the terminal and online, and a little bit more of that interview later on in the late edition of Balance of Power, because Joe and I are not done yet. We'll be back at 5.
Yeah, 8 days to go.
Yep.
Late edition of Balance of Power. Don't miss it. We'll have much more ahead as we distill a wild weekend on the trail and get ready for another day ahead. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines. This is Bloomberg.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Monday, October 28th. I had to check the date because I know the election's around the corner, and I know October is almost over.
I thought you were going to say something about Halloween. We got Halloween on Thursday. Do you have your costume yet?
There's that. No.
Okay. Well,
a lot of skeletons
there's still time.
in my neighborhood.
I thought you were going to say in your closet.
No, in my neighborhood. Hey, folks, it is, though, also a big week for earnings. And let's not forget, we get the last jobs report before the U.S. presidential election. That comes on Friday. So there's a lot going on this week.
Yeah, also why NVIDIA has a lot riding on this week's mega drop of Mag 7 earnings. Get a nice little read into how NVIDIA's sales are, even though earnings for that company aren't until next month.
Yeah, good point. Plus, why former President Donald Trump came back home for his MAGA rally. We're going to get into that in just a moment.
Also, we got the chairman of the State Bank of India, C.S. Sethi, stopping by to talk about the world's other most populous nation.
Yeah, everybody talking about investing in India, it seems. Also, we've got leadership in times of crisis and a new documentary on a little-known truth that has saved all of our lives. We're going to get to that over the next 60 minutes.
It is jam-packed. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business story. Here's Amy Morris in for Charlie Pellet.
All right, thank you, Tim. Volkswagen plans to close at least 3 factories in Germany as Europe's biggest automaker tries to slash expenses to become more competitive. VW labor chief Daniela Cavallo says they plan to downsize all remaining sites, putting tens of thousands of jobs at Volkswagen in Germany at risk. Volkswagen shares right now down about 0.5%, and we do expect to get earnings from Volkswagen on Wednesday. Boeing shares are down less than 1% after the plane maker launched a nearly $19 billion share sale to address liquidity needs and prevent a potential credit rating downgrade. The funds will help Boeing maintain its investment-grade rating and fund production ramp-up once the strike ends. And stocks are higher, but oil still sinking as a pivotal week back with key economic data. You guys were talking about it. And corporate earnings, that's all on the way. Among those, the results for 5 of the magnificent 7 big tech companies, plus economic growth prints for the U.S. and Eurozone, and the monthly payrolls report, and, of course, next week, the presidential election. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is up 24 points. NASDAQ is up 95 points. The Dow is up 305 points. And the Russell 2000 is up 36 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.28% and the 2-year yield at 4.15%. We were talking about oil earlier. NYMEX crude oil now down 5.6% at $67.76 a barrel. And Brent crude is down 5.5% at $71.84 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Master and Tim Stenovac.
Amy Morris, thank you so much. Well, yes, earnings this week are about several members of the Magnificent Seven group. We're talking about Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta platforms all laying out their businesses and outlooks. In all, nearly 42% of the S&P 500's market cap reporting results. It will also be a reveal of how well NVIDIA is doing and whether the AI trade and enthusiasm is for real or perhaps, Tim, getting ahead of itself.
Well, with more on how NVIDIA has so much riding on this week's earnings, let's get to Bloomberg News Equities reporter Carmen Reinecke. She joins us here in our Bloomberg Business Week studio. So, as I mentioned earlier, NVIDIA doesn't report until next month, but how did the results that we get this week, Carmen, give us an idea of how the company is doing in its own sales?
Yeah, so basically the 4 companies that you just mentioned that are reporting this week accounted for 40% of NVIDIA's sales in the second quarter. So what they are going to report in terms of capital expenditures is going to have huge read-through for what we're going to see for NVIDIA in the coming quarters. These companies are also expected to report a combined $56 billion in capital expenditures.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, this is a record. It's so much money, and really, this is all going to AI spend, or mostly going to AI spend, which is in turn mostly going to NVIDIA chips because it's really just by and far still the winner in that space.
I do wonder with the buy and spend when it comes to NVIDIA's chips, is there a cycle that we need to be smart about saying, okay, so maybe there's going to be a lot of spending in a couple of quarters and then maybe there's a bit of a pullback as they continue to build out and then they go back and buy more. Like we keep hearing about, shortage of supplies, like that feels like that's been such a big part of the narrative around NVIDIA's chips, but help me understand so that when we get these results, can be smart about whether or not it really is bad for NVIDIA?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. One thing that people are looking at is if there is going to be a slowdown as people sort of turn over, have to move to the next chip. That's why we're so focused on anything that we can hear from NVIDIA or from clients about Blackwell. So far, the company has said that everything is fine. It's on track to ramp in the second half of next year. But you're right. If these companies aren't needing to spend as much, if they're able to sort of keep the chips that they have, that could mean the sort of incredible revenue growth that we've seen from NVIDIA could come in. Ultimately, it's going to come in just because the comps quarter over quarter are going to get more difficult.
Right.
But obviously, investors will just want to know that there's still growth going forward.
Maybe one of the reasons, Carol, we saw Jensen Huang last week out in India making those big moves when it comes to tying up with Reliance Industries, Tata, and the like.
Yeah, kind of really laying out the footprint, right, to make sure that kind of the dominance, I guess, continues, right, going forward.
Yeah, exactly, and making sure that they're not, so reliant just on like Taiwan Semi or just that part of the world.
Okay, so go ahead, Carol.
What among those Mag 7, is there one in particular that you think investors should be focusing on, or is it equally kind of laid out?
The thing is that the stories are so different across all four of them that I do think that it's important for investors to be looking at each and every one. I mean, just even the stock moves are so different. I'm looking at Microsoft and Meta for later in this week, and Microsoft shares have trailed the S&P, but Meta is one of the best performers. So those companies are reporting on the same day. You have to look at both. These are all such important companies, as you were saying. I mean, a huge part of the S&P.
Does it get to the point at some point soon, Carmen, where we don't necessarily need to see these companies continue to spend because they have whatever chips they need? I know that's not great for NVIDIA, but is there a law of diminishing returns with this type of technology? Or is the idea that NVIDIA is going to come out with something after the Blackwell that these companies will then need to spend tens of billions of dollars on also?
I mean, I think that's like the million or billion or $1 trillion question, and is if NVIDIA can continue to innovate and spin it forward, and I think that's really what they're trying to do. That's what we're seeing with Blackwell. I'm sure that there are plans even beyond that to just continue to build compute, to continue to build speed, and all of these things. But yeah, that's why people are watching the capex on these companies so closely, because it matters.
And NVIDIA's had the first mover advantage. That stock, by the way, up 185% so far here in 2024. Yep, just a shabby almost 200%. All right, Carmen, thank you so much. Bloomberg News equities reporter Carmen Reinecke joining us here in our Bloomberg studio. That's one focus for investors this week. Tim, we got to get to the other one.
Yeah, that's certainly U.S. elections. 8 days until Election Day. Both candidates hitting the campaign trail over the weekend, tapping big venues and big celebrities and making their final pitches to voters.
For the past 9 years, we have been fighting against the most sinister and corrupt forces on earth. With your vote in this election, you can show them once and for all that this nation does not belong to them.
And I'm going to tell you, as I travel around our country, there is an overwhelming call for a fresh start. For a new generation of leadership that is optimistic and excited about what we can do together.
All right, of course, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on the campaign trail, both laying out their vision going forward. Safe to say it's a campaign season that has seen both focusing on those key swing states and also venturing to states that are not, and that they pretty much have no chance of winning. For Donald Trump, that included a big rally in New York City yesterday.
All right, for more, it takes us to a most read story on the Bloomberg today and why Trump's campaign came to New York. Back with us is Bloomberg Opinion Senior Executive Editor Tim O'Brien. He's here in our Bloomberg Business Week studio. Tim, also the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Tim, you have a great column out today about why Trump came back to New York City. I mean, this is a place that he left a few years ago, but it was a place that also built his fortune. Why did Trump come back here?
I don't think it was strategy, Tim. It makes no sense to come to New York if you're at the tail end of a race in which 7 swing states, New York not being one of them, is going to determine the outcome. I think he came for personal reasons. He is a New Yorker to his core, and I think he's decamped to Palm Beach, but he'll always be a New Yorker. He wants the city to love him. He got tried in 3 different trials that ended up with very embarrassing judgments for him that sort of seemed like the end of his run here. but he clearly wasn't done with it. And I think he came back to Madison Square Garden in part to show that he was still around to New Yorkers, but probably more importantly, New York's the media capital of the world. And I think he wanted a lot of eyeballs and he wanted a lot of attention for what he had to say on Sunday. I think what came out of that convention or out of that rally is something we should really reflect upon. But he did come, I think, for the media scrutiny.
I want to get into what we should be reflecting upon, but I want to go back to, you have come into this studio and talked to us about Donald Trump being a master of media, and he understands, right, the optics of being at Madison Square Garden, and a huge crowd around him and kind of laying it out there.
And, you know, sort of repeating the roll call of speakers who were at the RNC in July. I was there. It was very similar to the RNC. Hulk Hogan showed up again. He ripped his shirt off. Trump gave a closing speech that was somnambulant and rambling, and I don't know if it did anything for him again, tactically or strategically, but it allowed him to sort of indulge his own need to be in the spotlight.
In terms of some of the folks that spoke at yesterday's rally, it does seem like obviously, there were some things that have gotten a lot of media attention, and most or many Americans would be or are appalled by what was said in a nation that is, you know, the result of immigrants. Having said that, what's your understanding of campaigns and how much the Trump team knew who was going to be there, what they were going to say in terms of what they said at the rally?
Well, I mean,
because they seem to be backing off, saying, "Oh, you know, a little bit."
Yeah,
like
I mean, so the rally was a fountain of misogyny, racism, xenophobia, a lot of talk about the other. I don't think it's partisan or ideological to make that observation. It's just about tolerance and core values. And there were heinous, ugly things said on that stage. Whether or not Trump's political team vetted the speakers who came out, I mean, there were, you know, sort of C-list comedians and
I didn't know a lot of the names.
And who just, you know, became sort of like fraternity bros, screeching racist rants. If they didn't vet them, they should have. If they did, then they shouldn't have let them on the stage. They were on the stage because they're articulating part of what Donald Trump's message is, which is that he's threatened by the other. His campaign is threatened by the other. They define the other broadly, whether it's China or people of color or immigrants or Democrats or women, on down the list. And there was a lot of that last night.
Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian that we're all talking about, his joke that is getting a lot of attention today is about comparing Puerto Rico to a pile of trash in the ocean. The Trump campaign did something rare, and they actually came out and said that wasn't part of their view. It's not often that they'll rebuke people who speak at their rallies. Tim, what was notable to me, though, and it wasn't even a rebuke, but what was notable to me is that was sort of the only part that they distanced themselves from.
Right. I mean, there was you know, equally horrific stuff said about Kamala Harris and her race and her gender and her nationality. Also, you know, Hinchcliffe may have been a comedian, but what he said wasn't a joke. It was a racist smear. And I would argue that probably they thought it might be safe to put that in the mouth of a comedian, so there was deniability. Oh, can't you just take a joke when we gotten too politically correct, that you just can't see something funny about slagging an entire territory?
So fair to say that the Trump campaign accomplished what it set out to do yesterday, or is the fact that we are focused on this and not his sit down with Joe Rogan that aired on Saturday the focus of what we're talking about?
Well, you know, at one point during Trump's comments at the Garden, he said, you know, the Republican Party is the party of inclusion, and I really like that. While everything being said around him was as divisive as imaginable. So if their goal was actually to embrace this idea that the Republican Party could be a unifying force at a moment when we have great political polarization, they failed utterly. The other way to interpret that is they actually aren't serious about any of that, and they're willing to indulge racism or extremism in the service of Trumpism and Trump's own candidacy.
There's what Donald Trump said and the others said on stage, but there's also all of the Americans and voting public that were around them that didn't necessarily boo, didn't necessarily walk out. And I guess, like him or not, Donald Trump, I constantly think about half of America who are okay with this.
That is a great observation, because it's a little simplistic to simply point the finger at Donald Trump. He is an outcome as much as he's a cause of these things. And he represents something that's been in the United States for a very long time. We fought a civil war here.
Right.
Slavery existed here, on and on and on. And I think people have to decide what they want to say their authentic values are, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. When it comes to, I think, racism and sexism and this kind of vitriol, no one should embrace it.
You know that vitriol from Donald Trump directly, right? You were the subject of a lawsuit from him, wrote a book on him. If there is a second term in the White House, what's your biggest fear?
Well, I think Trump has told us what that's going to be. I think.
Do you agree with those, though, Tim, that say, "Oh, it's just show, and he's not going to actually do all that stuff"? Forgive me for interrupting.
No, that's fine. I think he deeply wants to do these things. I think he has authoritarian impulses. I think he wants to weaponize the Justice Department against his enemies. He said he's going to do that. I think he wants to silence dissent within the country. He said he wants to do that. I think he wants ideological sniff tests at public schools. He's a book banner. He is going to institutionalize things in this country that most Americans aren't used to being around. And I think we have to really think about what that means.
Why do you think we've seen such a silence, at least this time around, from corporate America, from large media organizations, a couple in the news right now over the last week, the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, for coming out and saying we're not going to endorse anyone this time around? Why do you think we're seeing that silence right now?
Well, because, people become cowed by power. And I think the anticipation in recent weeks is that Trump's polling numbers have improved against Harris. If he becomes president again, certainly businesses have reason to wonder whether or not he'll weaponize the powers at his disposal of the federal government against them. The media is concerned about it. Everyone's concerned about it because the presidency is a powerful office. And I think people are hedging their bets. The issue is, do you hedge your bets at the expense of ethics and decency and democracy and other values, or do you hedge them for just raw self-interest and a lack of courage?
If Donald Trump, I always think about this, like if he hadn't come to power, if he hadn't become president, would we still have this division and this hate?
Well, so I think the division has always existed. I think Trump just made it more comfortable for people to express it more openly. Social media gave it a place to sort of proliferate in a way that prior media environments didn't. And for people to sort of live in echo chambers where they're not talking to their neighbors and getting different points of view. And I think we have to come to terms with it as a country. And if there's a virtue to the arrival of Donald Trump, is he stripped this Band-Aid off, these myths we tell ourselves about the country's about, and we should take that on in a transparent and full-blooded way.
Without asking you to give a prediction, what do the next 8 days look like, or what does Wednesday?
That sounds like you're asking me to give you a prediction, my friend.
Or it might be 9 or 10 or 11 days.
I sound like a broken record. It appears, based on the polling, to be a very close race. However, I think the polls in the last few cycles have been wildly off in terms of outcome, within their margins of error statistically, but not close in terms of ultimate outcomes. And I think this race could end up surprising people in terms of what we see next week.
Does the early voting, like so much early voting, say something to you?
Well, I think, the positive thing about early voting is the voters are engaging, and you want that, and it appears that voters from both parties are engaging, and that's a good thing. People shouldn't sit on their couches when they have the ability to vote.
Agreed. Thanks for engaging with us. Always. Bloomberg Opinion Senior Executive Editor Tim O'Brien, of course, joining us in studio. You could read Tim's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion. You can find it on the Bloomberg or at Bloomberg.com/opinion.
When we come back, leaders, political, business, and otherwise, are preparing for the next crisis, wherever it may come from. We're going to tackle that next. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Markets are higher while oil is sliding as we launch into a busy week for economic data and corporate earnings. We check the markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 0.4%. NASDAQ up just about 0.5%, and the Dow up 0.7%. The Russell 2000 up 1.6%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.28%. The 2-year yield at 4.15%. NYMEX crude oil is down 5.8%, now 5.9%. There it goes. And the Brent crude oil is down 5.9% as well. Barclays is considering re-entering Saudi Arabia as it looks to capitalize on that kingdom's growing need to access capital markets around the world. Barclays CEO said on the sidelines of the kingdom's future investment initiative that the lender plans to grow its team across the Middle East region, including in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, in addition to Riyadh. Boeing planned a nearly $19 billion share sale, one of the largest ever by a public company, to address the troubled plane maker's liquidity needs and stave off a potential credit rating downgrade to junk. Shares of Boeing down about 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec.
Hey, thank you so much for that update. Really do appreciate it. What would you like to hear about on Bloomberg Radio? Help make shows like ours even better. All you got to do is take the Bloomberg Audience Survey. To do that, just go to youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcast. Then click the link in our profile or community section to take the survey. It's hosted by our partners over at Material. Fill it out now at youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcasts.
All right, Tim. So, we often look at history and past market cycles, past economic cycles to really understand where we are today and where we may be going. It's not a given, as shocks like the great financial crisis and the global pandemic showed us, but the past can help in gaming out the possible scenarios that investors and all of us may be dealing with. And that is something that the 9/11 Memorial Museum thinks about, Memorial and Museum, I should say, thinks about as well. As they note on their website, nearly a quarter century after 9/11, the lessons learned have emerged with deeper clarity, highlighting key elements of crisis response and continuity that resonate deeply with a new generation of professionals at companies, agencies, and a range of organizations.
With more with us here in the studio, the president and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, Beth Hillman. The Memorial and Museum, it is supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg Philanthropies and Bloomberg LP. Mike is, of course, of Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies.
Yeah, very involved in the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. Beth, great to have you here with us. We've kind of been talking about the environment before we got going. 9/11 for me always makes me kind of stop and think about where we are in terms of, first of all, what happened that day and how we as Americans began to think very differently, I think it's safe to say, about what national security means and the role of geopolitics in it all. How do you guys continue to think about what security means here for Americans?
For you, Carol, and for me, 9/11 brings up those memories. But there are 100 million Americans born since or too young to remember 9/11 for themselves. Right. Yet there's so many crises upon us now and ahead of us, environmental, geopolitical, health, that we'll need the kind of leadership that helped us respond to 9/11 in order to get through. So for us, we've realized the crisis leadership programs that we've built over time are responsive to that tremendous need out there right now for people at all levels of leadership within an organization, public and private sectors, to figure out how they can respond to crises they didn't anticipate.
For me, it's hard to think about this as being history because it didn't feel like it happened that long ago. And I think for many of us who were alive and old enough to remember what happened, it's still so vivid, and the images are still so vivid in our heads. But how at the museum and at the memorial do you convey what happened that day and what happened after to a generation that didn't live it?
Well, I think the value of visiting the memorial and the museum in person is really unmatched in helping to convey
Agreed.
what happened because of the power of the design, of the text, of the images, of the care that went into virtually every decision about how our visitors encounter the memorial and then the museum itself. We have work, though, to reach the people who can't come in person to the memorial and to the museum. So we now have programs that actually translate some of those lessons outside. But I do think you're right that there's a lot of people who that's so vivid for. They have a hard time unpacking it, yet it's distant enough in time that we've had time to study and to actually understand what happened. And we realize that people came from across New York, the country, the world, to respond to those terrorist attacks and to help New York and the Pentagon, and then in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the other sites and the people who were affected start to heal, to recover, and to rebuild, and to make sure we remember what was lost that day too.
Beth, we always talk about the great financial crisis and how the role of CFO changed dramatically, right? Because they had to figure out how to keep their company around. Same thing for the global pandemic. 9/11, in terms of what is needed in leaders today, how has that impacted it?
You know, you hit it. The security function that we didn't really realize was at the center of what every organizational leader has to reckon with. After 9/11 was certainly on the table, and our Summit on Security brings together private and public sector leaders in security fields who are working to make sure their employees are safe, their customers, their clients, their communities are safe. Because without that baseline of knowing what to expect and how you'd respond when something goes wrong, because we do know it will go wrong, it's that ability to respond in a crisis that 9/11 taught us we all really have to have from the top to the bottom of our organizations.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, because when you came in, I was like, okay, underachiever. You have a BS in electrical engineering from Duke, an MA in history from the University of Pennsylvania, a JD from Yale Law School, PhD in history from Yale University. And I feel like that just gives you what an incredible view on kind of the world and how we look at things. What are the specific skills that you think a leader needs today in order to deal with threats that may come from all different places?
I think that being empathetic and understanding the impact that any crisis has on the people who are experiencing it, realizing that they're already responding and their contributions have to be recognized, being able to communicate effectively, it's so important today. You can't communicate too often or too much, and then being calm and decisive, and that's really what some of the iconic leaders that speak actually in our new Leading Through Crisis program.
Like who?
Like Mike Bloomberg, Bob Iger, Ken Chenault, Bill McRaven. There are, and many others, including first responders and private sector leaders, principals of schools, who were actually on that day figuring out what to do. And as they reflect on and they talk about that, it really honestly gives you hope that people can figure out what to do and they can come together when a crisis hits.
The thing is, though, is security has changed a lot in terms of what threats are in, a quarter of a century. We have this whole element of what foreign states or bad actors could do online, targeting infrastructure, cybersecurity, ransomware, and the like. How have you seen the conversations around that shift from those types of targets to perhaps, not a stadium necessarily full of people?
Right, it's interesting. One of the speakers in this year's Summit on Security is the NFL head of security, so Kathy Lanier. No one who's taking care of people at a stadium thinks they don't have to worry about cybersecurity. They realize there's a connection between the virtual and the real that means that their preparedness in all of those arenas that you just described is essential to the actual physical security of people. Protecting our water safety, for instance, is a technical challenge as well as a physical challenge. So I think what we've realized is that the proliferation of different threats has just broadened the scope of the security professionals responsible and the leaders responsible for keeping all those different elements of our basic security in place.
Jamie Dimon said something about it being like the most threats in terms of geopolitics that he can remember of his career. Forgive me if I'm not quoting it, exactly. I mean, JP Morgan has hired someone on climate, but he's looking at the world and where the threats are coming from. Is the world, I don't know, how do you assess it? How dangerous is it? I mean, I know I asked for the panel I did for you guys in the upcoming summit, and it was Nikki Haley and it was Tom Nides, former U.S. ambassador to Israel. Nikki Haley, of course, former U.S. ambassador to the UN. They both, I think it was Nikki who said 8, and I think Tom said incredibly dangerous. I mean, these are people who understand it from the inside, and I just wonder, do you feel like we're getting better information? Do you feel like leaders are feeling more stressed? Like, how do you see it?
I think that eternal vigilance is always the lesson of people trying to keep others safe and protect our communities and our nation and the world. I think that we didn't realize how dangerous the world was on September 10th.
We never thought something like that could happen.
2001. We felt differently on the 12th, and then we responded since.
You were talking about this, Carol, and you brought this up too. We never thought it would happen. I can remember January 6th, 2021. I think a lot of Americans never thought that would happen. And that type of attack actually happening from within the United States. What do you hear from executives at a time when there's serious political turmoil in our country, just a few days away from the election, how they're navigating this idea that, yes, there's tension within our country too?
I think that creating a sense of community, creating the kind of culture within an organization that can hold people through difficult times, and also remembering, I'm trained as a historian, I think we've seen a lot before. We've forgotten about a lot of what we've seen. The 9/11 Memorial Museum is committed to making sure we don't forget what happened on 9/11. But we have forgotten many of the tremendous challenges and periods of turmoil that we've been through in the United States. They're communicated in a different way now, and they feel more and less immediate, I think, than they have in the past to different sectors of our world. But it's really important to remember we've been through a lot, and people are resilient, and there's rarely one point in time that determines winning or losing. So continuing, regardless of the consequences, I think is important to every agency and organization and company out there.
It's interesting. I think about that a lot, Beth. I think, my dad and his 3 brothers all fought in World War II, and I wish they were still around, because I'm like, I want to pick their brain about the stresses they felt at that time versus what we feel today. I think about with all the college campus protests around the war between Israel and Hamas, and how we had, was it David Weston or somebody who came in and said, during the 60s, right, race riots and the protesting over Vietnam War and so on and so forth. We've seen these times before, but we didn't have social media as much, and the velocity of information, and maybe inaccurate information, false information. And I just wonder how leaders are grappling with all of that, whether they're managing their institutions, their employees, and just trying to figure it out.
I think you're right. It's definitely different conditions than when we faced these challenges in the past. But we also have a lot more muscle than we used to, in terms of during World War II, it was a time when most women didn't contribute to the economy, to the polity, to the intellectual life of the nation, as well as many other marginalized groups. That's a lot more intellectual firepower. That's a lot more people who can help. It's a lot more literal muscle that's out there. So there are a lot of reasons to have hope, notwithstanding the challenges that are out there.
I'll take hope on this Monday with 8 days to go till the election. Really interesting stuff. The summit is coming up on...
It launches on the 12th. November 12th it launches, and we're very excited. It's a set of virtual programs with the top leaders across the public and private sector, the nation's top law enforcement official, the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray. There's a tremendous number of people to learn from and to listen to. The director of an agency, the administrator of an agency created after 9/11, the TSA, will help teach us how we can respond to what's out there right now.
Isn't it amazing? Like, you think there was a time when there was no TSA, right? Remember when we all used to walk right up to the gate?
Didn't have to take your shoes off when you were going through airport security.
Meet our families coming right off the plane. It's great stuff, and we participate in some of the panels and definitely learn a lot. So thank you so much for joining us.
Grateful for your support. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Beth Hillman, President and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, joining us right here in studio.
Up next, the invisible shield that saves lives. That's next on Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. This is the busiest week for corporate earnings. 5 of the magnificent 7 big tech companies report third quarter results starting tomorrow with Google parent Alphabet. And a week before a Fed gathers to reflect on the appropriate tempo of interest rate cuts, data is set to show underlying resilience in the economy and a temporary hiccup in jobs growth. McDonald's shares are up 1.6%. The company putting quarter pounders back on the menu after ruling out the beef patties as the source for a multi-state E. coli outbreak that left one person dead and sickened dozens of others. The infections appear to be linked to the slivered onions served on quarter pounders. Those burgers will return to the menu without the onions. Former President Trump's social media startup is extending a 5-week surge. That's pushed the stock up by some 272% from a September 26th low. As retail traders tout those shares, the stock jumped as much as 17% earlier today. It's up 19% now, the highest since July 15th. And we do check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 23 points, NASDAQ up 84. The Dow is up 315 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.27%. The 2-year yield at 4.14%. We've been watching oil for you all day. NYMEX crude oil now down more than 6% at $67.42 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Public health saved your life today, but you didn't even know it. Viruses, pathogens, threaten to bring us to our knees. We need to tell the story of public health.
I'm really worried that any pandemic can just, because we are not yet prepared.
Inequality is a root cause of illness.
The trust level is broken.
It's the politicization that's killing us. Public health is like the foundation of your house. And let me tell you, ours is cracked.
All right, that, of course, is public health. And the story of public health is the subject of a new documentary. It is called The Invisible Shield. It's a 4-part series that reveals a little-known truth. The series, by the way, made possible by Bloomberg Philanthropies and Radical Media and airs on Bloomberg TV tonight through Thursday at 6 p.m. Wall Street time.
We've got with us Dr. Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's in the series. He's also the author, or the co-author of The Opioid Epidemic, What Everyone Needs to Know. Dr. Sharfstein joins us from the American Public Health Conference in Minneapolis, where he and others are holding a screening event a little later today with 3,000 public health professionals. Dr. Sharfstein, nice to have you back with us. You joined us regularly during the height of the pandemic, and we certainly appreciated that. We appreciate this. I want you to talk a little bit about the invisible shield, because I think that was a really striking clip, because yes, each and every day we're essentially protected from disease and from an early death by public health innovations that have been made over the past few thousand years. How should we be thinking about this in our day-to-day life?
You know, there's a saying that public health saved your life today, but you didn't even know it. We go about our daily lives, we're able to do all the things we want to do, in part because we're not suffering horrible injuries or tainted food poisoning, or we're choking on dirty air or contaminated water. But we sort of take those things in stride now because the public health system has been so successful. But we really can't take it for granted. And the message of this series is how much work has gone into building up this shield and how fragile it can be. And we need to now really pay attention to it.
You know, I do think about when you talk about public health, I think there are so many things that people just take for granted about what public health has done, Dr. Sharfstein. So what are those initiatives? What is it when we talk so much about public health? What are those things that we take for granted and, that are so important?
It used to be that most families, if they didn't have a child die in the first couple of years of life, they certainly had a relative who had a child die. It was a very, very common occurrence that children die. The president of the United States had children die. And it was because of all kinds of preventable diseases. And those are gone. And, infant mortality is much, much more rare. It's just one window into the kinds of things that public health has done for us. And what we saw in the pandemic is that people can get very upset at public health, and they can wonder why we even have a public health system. But that is a very dangerous way of thinking because of all the things that public health does. You know, I'm sitting in this hotel room here in Minneapolis for this big conference, and you know, I can just go to the tap and get water. You know, I can walk outside without, you know, trouble breathing the air, which isn't true in other countries necessarily. And there's so many things that we need public health to keep delivering. And with the nature of the challenges that we have today, the way that viruses can traverse the world so quickly, all the other problems out there, we need public health to keep us safe. And that's a critically important message, and really appreciating the history makes that message even stronger.
But it also comes at a time, Dr. Sharfstein, where trust in these so-called institutions isn't necessarily high, or it's deteriorating quite a bit over the last few years. We certainly saw that during the pandemic, and we see that with the way that's playing out in the election right now with who different candidates want to appoint to certain positions, and the way that some of them are skeptics of institutions and also of vaccines, for example. How do you do that at a time where there is this skepticism, there is this mistrust of institutions?
Well, that is what we'll be talking about today at the conference. It's something on a lot of people's minds in public health. One of the answers is to essentially go analog, to not just rely on messages you're posting on the web or press releases you're putting out, but to be meeting people in communities with people that they already trust. So it's their doctor, it's their faith leader, a local business, really making sure that people are hearing messages, not just online, because online you're competing against just a flood of falsehoods on many of these issues like vaccines, but actually in the real world, people they trust, and the public health community has to really adapt to that reality, both in terms of the humility that we have and the transparency that we offer, but also in the kinds of partnerships that we can develop so that people really understand they're getting good information from people who care about them. In public health, we care that you get to live the life you want to live, that you're healthy to see your children grow up, and that your children can grow up. And having that message delivered not just by the person who's for the government, that is, you know, people are being told not to believe, but that message is also being delivered by people in your community. That's, I think, one of the solutions.
You know, one thing I wanted to ask you, Dr. Sharfstein, is, you know, what is your biggest concern when it comes to the U.S. election outcome and what it may mean for public health spending and work or attention and the impact that it could ultimately have on the U.S. public? Safe to say there are many that already feel like the U.S. system or the U.S. government leaves them behind. So I'm just curious what could happen on this front.
Well, you know, I can tell you as someone on the advisory committee to the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that this challenge that we're talking about is very well understood right now, and that there are a lot of changes being put into place to try to address it, to try to build trust through partnerships, good information, and transparency. I'll be frank, I'm a little concerned about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walking around and saying, you know, he's going to be in charge of all the public health agencies. This is someone who is just a font of conspiracy theories and lies about public health, and who I think could do grave damage to not just how people perceive public health, but the actual work of public health. And the consequences of that are the consequences that, frankly, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been involved in causing, which are massive outbreaks of preventable disease. And so I'm worried. I'm worried with the outcome of the election and what could happen afterwards.
I'm glad you brought up Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Dr. Sharfstein. What, in your view, could he do if he were put in a position of power over Health and Human Services, for example? What could he do? What could he undo? And what could be the consequences of that?
Well, you know, I think that it's good that we have different kinds of checks and balances. There's some really great people, many really great people who work in federal agencies who are obligated under the law to do the right thing, you know, for the public. But we certainly have heard claims that new administration should revoke the approval of vaccines, revoke the approval of abortion medications, revoke the approval really without any meaningfully, persuasive scientific justification. And so, we all take it for granted that we can send our kids to school and they're not going to get measles there. But if you revoke the approval of a vaccine, then, that's going to happen. And when there are enough kids getting measles, kids start to die from measles. And it's like, that's why we have a measles vaccine. So there's a lot of potential risks. I can't handicap how likely they'd be, but I can tell you that it is very concerning to have someone who has been so hostile and so conversant with falsehoods saying that, he's going to be bossing people around at agencies that we all rely on to protect our health.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Dr. Sharfstein, as always, thank you so much. Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, also talking to us about the new documentary series, The Invisible Shield, made possible by Bloomberg Philanthropies and Radical Media. The Bloomberg School of Public Health, by the way, supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies. The series airing on Bloomberg TV tonight through Thursday at 6 p.m. Wall Street time. All right, folks, now let's get to a region of the world that we are seeing increasingly catch the attention of investors.
And that is India. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon says there's a substantial opportunity for India as companies look to diversify their supply chains away from China. That's according to an interview with CNBC TV 18. He did caution, though, that the transition will take years as firms navigate the complexities of relocating operations. Increasingly, Carol, we see a growing number of stories about companies expanding their presence in India and investors certainly making bets there.
Yeah, I printed out a bunch of them. With a view on the Indian economy, we are delighted to have with us the chairman of the State Bank of India, C.S. Sethi, which is the largest public sector bank and the biggest lender in India. He joins us here in studio. Chair Sethi, so nice to have you here on Bloomberg Television and radio. You were in D.C., let's start there, for the IMF meetings. What at the meetings gave you optimism for India and the world more broadly, and what did not?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I think the positive news which emerged in the IMF meetings is that the global inflation is coming down. That's a good news. While the growth rate seems to be moderate, still in the range of 3 to 3.5%, the bright spark obviously is India, which is expected to grow at around 7% to 7.2%. Even the IMF places the growth rate at 7%. The Central Bank of India believes that the growth rate could be 7.2%. I think it's a really interesting story which is unfolding in India, both in terms of growth trajectory which the country is taking on, and the equity market is doing well, and the inflation is also moderating there, while the food inflation is still a matter of concern there in India.
So let's talk about some different sectors of the economy. You heard me mention the comments by Jamie Dimon over at JP Morgan Chase about supply chains transitioning to India. On the ground, what can you tell us about that actually happening in India right now?
Yeah, I think there's most visible success stories, of course, Apple. 25% of Apple 16 is produced in India. A couple of things which are very seriously being pursued by the government of India is a performance-linked incentive for various industries, more than 16 to 20 industries, particularly in the areas of electronics and semiconductors. These are the sectors which are getting the performance-linked incentive from the government of India. And there's a good amount of foreign capital which is coming in into these sectors.
And what in particular? Tell us a little bit about that. I think I'm not kidding when we say the ton of stories. I have a pile.
A stack of stories that we have.
India eclipsing China and MSCI global stock ages to drive flows. That was back in mid-September. Blackstone sees Asia as growth engine, has scale in India.
Jensen Huang was there last week.
Brookfield to add to its $13 billion bet on India's projects. So there's so much going on. You point that out. Where in particular, give us some insight for our Bloomberg audience, who's a global audience, about where the money has picked up dramatically.
So the money is mainly coming in the couple of sectors, particularly in the renewables. I think there's a huge amount of focus with the commitment what India has given under the COP26 that by 2030, the addition in the renewable energy would be almost 500 gigawatts. That is attracting a lot of attention. And the logistics is another area, the warehousing, roads, ports. These are all the areas which are attracting the global investment, in a big manner.
I was in India now like 12 years ago. And one of the things that I found so dramatic, and it was a trip that I took at like 2 in the morning with my team. We were going to Agra to see the Taj Mahal. But what was fascinating is that's when you saw everything moving around, because that's when the roads were less busy.
Yes.
And just so much infrastructure moving around. What can you tell us, too, about the infrastructure build-out that many have deemed so necessary to take India to the next level?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important requirements for Indian economy to continue to grow is strengthening the infrastructure. And there are two things which are happening. I think there's a significant government expenditure, capital expenditure, which is focused on the infrastructure building up. And there's a private investment also is coming in a big manner in terms of infrastructure. We see a lot of airports being built, seaports being strengthened, and road network, of course, is one of the best now in India. And we have dedicated freight corridors which are coming in, to enhance the speed of moving the goods from one place to another. So I think,
I was just going to say, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to move from the macro to the micro and talk a little about your plans over at SBI and where you're thinking about expansion in terms of parts that you're focused on growing. What are the goals for growth over the next 6 months, 2 years?
So, as you know, I think in terms of the reach, we have one of the best reaches. We have the largest network of branches, largest network of ATMs. We have served almost 500 million customers, and every Indian family in some way, is engaged with SBI. We have significantly invested in the technology and digitalization in the last 2-3 years, and we would like to leverage that technology and digitalization to reach the underserved, unserved across the country. Still, I think, there are a lot of banking needs which are unmet in India, which we want to reach them. And this investment in technology and digitalization has helped us to reach the bottom of the pyramid in a much lower cost, which means that, the investment in technology helped us to increase our operational efficiency. My focus in the next 6 months would be that how do I leverage the investments, what we made in technology, to increase the operational efficiency and productivity of our employees.
I am curious, too, that, we've noticed, too, that deposits have been challenging for a lot of, or really all Indian lenders for the past few quarters. So your strategies that have worked, and what else do you plan to do? What's really worked in terms of building out deposits?
Yeah. One thing, of course, is, in India, despite so much digitalization, the physical presence is very much important in terms of deposit mobilization. And we have the largest physical presence there. Number two, we have...
Does that mean you continue to build out the physical presence?
We do. We want to enter into areas where we know we don't have a branch. We would like to set up that physical branch. And we have a very strong mobile application, which is... currently, you will be surprised that every day we open 50 to 60,000 savings bank account a day.
Wow.
So we have 27% market share in savings bank, which is the low-cost deposits. So our focus would be, how do we strengthen this franchise and start mobilizing more and more low-cost deposits.
And increasingly, just got about 15 seconds, are they wealthier deposits, too, that you're noticing? A lot of wealth creation we're seeing in India.
Yes, and we have largest number of clients who qualify to be wealth management customers. And we are investing in a wealth management technology to reach out to them.
AI too, just quickly.
AI, of course, a large-scale adoption of AI. You can't speak about banking without talking about AI.
You can't speak about anything, it seems, without talking about AI. Chair Sethi, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. C.S. Sethi, Chairman of the State Bank of India. For those who are watching on TV, the close is coming your way. Tim and I continue on Business Week.
is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by
is focused on last night's Donald Trump rally at Madison Square Garden. A comedian compared Puerto Rico to an island of garbage. Odyssey reporter Raquel Williams has reaction from Philadelphia.
Councilwoman Quetzi Lozada said not even a public apology would be accepted at this point.
Absolutely not. Don't be fooled. That is something that they are aligned with. The campaign believes that we are garbage. The campaign has no respect for Latinos.
The Trump campaign has distanced itself from the joke, saying it's not a reflection of Trump's views or that of the campaign. Raquel Williams for CBS News, Philadelphia.
The FBI is now joining the investigation into early morning fires that were set in ballot drop boxes in Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington. Hundreds of ballots were destroyed in the Vancouver fire. CBS News has obtained a federal bulletin that assesses individuals are likely to call for violence in response to false election narratives. Peter King has that.
The Homeland Security Bulletin says threat actors are calling for violent acts against both elections officials and, quote, populations that they perceive as threatening election integrity. They say the threats are motivated by the possibility of a closer contested election, state election law variations, and delays in vote counting. Mail-in voting is also an issue, and DHS says some online messages are promoting ways to sabotage ballot boxes.
The Pentagon said today 10,000 North Korean troops are in Russia. That's 3 times the previous estimate. And the UN Secretary General says they're moving in the direction of the border with Ukraine.
The deployment of North Korean troops represents a significant escalation.
President Biden called it dangerous. Israel is sending its Mossad spy chief back to Doha for Gaza ceasefire talks, while families of those held captive there appeal to the Knesset to bring the hostages home. Among them, this mom.
This is a horrible bleeding situation that is ongoing. Naama is there for 388 days.
McDonald's says its beef patties are not responsible for the E. coli outbreak, as Jason Brooks reports.
The hamburger chain announced it's bringing back its quarter pounder to all of its restaurants after ruling out the beef patty for a recent E. coli outbreak across the Midwest and Rocky Mountain states. Health officials confirmed that the outbreak was tied to the slivered onions McDonald's solely uses on the quarter pounder and not from any other ingredient.
Volkswagen says it's shutting at least 3 factories in Germany and laying off tens of thousands of workers. It's Europe's biggest car maker. This is CBS News.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, 60 minutes away, under 60 minutes away from the closing bell on Wall Street. Carol Masser, Tim Stenevec, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday. Let's get to it, because we are going to dig into geopolitics. Dr. Angela Stent of Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations joining us to talk all things NATO and Russia. It's an important conversation coming up in just a moment.
Also closely related to what's happening in the U.S. with the election, and on that, why Trump-Harris is unlikely to be a Supreme Court replay of the year 2000. Hanging Chad Anyone? Remember that, Carol?
Yeah, I do remember really well. And are we doing it wrong when it comes to teaching science? A Caltech chemistry professor says there is a better way. It's all coming up over the next 2 hours.
First up, though, a check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Amy Morris in for Charlie Pellet. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Tim. Stocks are higher. Traders are gearing up for earnings, the election, and the next Fed decision. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 up 24 points. NASDAQ up 81. The Dow is up 320 points. The Russell 2000 is up 35.5 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.27%. The 2-year yield at 4.13%. And NYMEX crude oil now down 5.7%. Apple started rolling out its first set of Apple Intelligence features and introduced a new 24-inch iMac desktop. Has a faster AI-focused M4 processor. The company said its Apple Intelligence software is now available for the iPhone, iPad, and Mac. Though Apple previewed a broader set of AI-related capabilities back in June, the initial features represent just a bit of Apple's plans for the service, and shares of Apple are 1.1% higher. Meta reportedly developing its own AI search engine. The information reports the owner of Facebook is working on a technology to provide conversational answers to people using its Meta AI chatbot. The efforts show the lengths to which Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg is going to reduce Meta's need for other major technology providers like Google or Microsoft. So now shares of Meta are up 1.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Amy. Do appreciate it. Republican vice presidential candidate and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance said Donald Trump would keep the U.S. in NATO if reelected, though it's important to note that the transatlantic alliance isn't, quote, just a welfare client. Vance spoke on NBC's Meet the Press on Sunday.
I think it's important, Kristen, that we recognize that NATO is not just a welfare client. Donald Trump wants NATO to be strong. He wants us to remain in NATO, but he also wants NATO countries to actually carry their share of the defense burden.
That was Republican vice presidential candidate and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance on Meet the Press on Sunday. No question, Dr. Angela Sten is watching this closely. She's senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a former national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. Earlier, she was in policy planning at the U.S. Department of State. She's also professor emerita of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. She's also the author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She joins us from London.
Dr. Sten, Angela, so great to have you back with us. What do you think, depending on the outcome of the U.S. election, if it is Donald Trump for a second term, what will be likely the relationship between U.S. and NATO?
Well, President Trump and, of course, Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance have both been very critical of NATO, but particularly former President Trump, saying that these countries don't carry their full share of the defense burden, as if this is totally a one-way relationship and that NATO is some kind of protection racket. Our allies do things for us, too. But I do think what will happen is countries will be under pressure to spend more on defense, and not all NATO members even spend the required 2% on defense. Some, like Poland, spend much more. And I think what President Trump has also said is that maybe the U.S. wouldn't agree to defend countries who don't spend enough on defense. So there'll be a lot of uncertainty. The last time around, apparently former President Trump wanted to pull the U.S. out of NATO. There's now legislation saying that he can't do that. It'll be a much rockier relationship with NATO, but NATO understands that, and the other NATO countries have been taking measures to try and insulate themselves against some big break.
Right. And also, NATO certainly watching closely as this war continues to wage on, what are we getting to, our third winter here between Russia and Ukraine. Having said that, layer on the recent news that Russia made a decision to bring North Korean troops to shore up its war-weary forces. What does that say to you? We constantly talk about interesting geopolitical alliances in today's environment, but that move in particular says what? You're the expert here.
Well, first of all, it says that the Russians, they're having a mobilization problem. So are the Ukrainians. But the Russians feel that they need more troops. The Ukrainians did invade the Kursk region of Russia. They've taken some of the territory. Russia has been pushing them back. But apparently what these 10,000 troops, if we're to believe the Pentagon will do, North Korean troops, is actually go to the Kursk region and fight to try and take back all of this territory from Ukraine. And in fact, the Ukrainian army has now published, given its soldiers a phrase book of Ukrainian, North Korean phrases in the hope that maybe some of these North Korean troops will not continue fighting. So I think it's quite serious. It really, you know, this is the first time you have these foreign troops fighting on Russian soil, and I think that it could lead to greater instability. I mean, depending on what happens, it could also be quite detrimental to the Ukrainians if these North Korean soldiers are able to push them back further from the Kursk region, because this was an element that the Ukrainians hope would be a bargaining leverage for them if and when there are negotiations with Russia.
I want to point out South Korea is considering whether to send weapons directly to Ukraine, reversing a policy banning lethal aid to the country at war. This is according to a senior South Korean official. Seoul has previously backfilled the U.S. for shipments that has made, and our reporting noting that if some of Seoul's vast stores of artillery shells started heading directly to Kyiv alongside Pyongyang's supplies to Russia, that would result in the war drawing upon two of the world's largest artillery forces. To me, that would say a broadening out. Is that a fair assessment, Angela? And makes me wonder what
Yes,
next?
I think so. And I think, yeah, and I think that we also understand that the South Koreans are now going to give much more intelligence help to the Ukrainians in their fight with Russia. But it does. I think it could broaden it out. And I think, I'm not sure that the Chinese are very happy about this. But, you know, Putin has justified this by saying we have a strategic relationship with North Korea, and we've been attacked on our territory. Therefore, they can help us. And this really raises the prestige of North Korea. You know, a country where many of these soldiers are very short because they're malnourished, a country that can't feed its own people, and yet, you know, has nuclear weapons and is now fighting in Russia.
We're in a very interesting moment where we have the world's wealthiest person, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, has been in contact with Vladimir Putin. I'm talking about that bombshell report last week from the Wall Street Journal that reported that Elon Musk had been in regular contact with the Russian president since late 2022. The discussions, according to the journal, were confirmed by several current and former U.S., European, and Russian officials. A reminder that he has security clearance due to a lot of the government work that SpaceX does. Dr. Stent, to what extent should we be concerned about Elon's conversations with Putin?
Well, I think we should be very concerned. You know, I wonder what the motivation behind this is. Putin has said, well, we just talked once and it was about space. But even if they're talking about space exploration, as you yourself said, Mr. Musk has high security clearances. He knows a lot. What's he telling the Russians? Apparently, he wants to make sure that, you know, Starlink will be able to use whatever terrestrial stations it needs to continue operating, and that Russia, you know, could be an important part of it. It is the largest country in the world, but it raises very serious questions. And then, of course, you have Elon Musk's support of former President Trump. You know, he's paying people to register to vote. And of course, you have the reports of former President Trump's conversations with Putin that have happened since he was president. And you just wonder where all this is leading. You know, Musk is a very wealthy man. Putin is reportedly also a very wealthy man. So I don't know if this is part of the club of billionaires, but there should be security concerns here.
You know, it's interesting. We use interesting a lot this year, or the last couple of years, or the last decade. But what I'm thinking about is we kid but not kid about these bromances, whether it's Donald Trump and Elon Musk, or whether it's Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. You've studied Putin. I think we've talked about this before. Is there a real relationship there? Or I think we've talked about Putin in the past and kind of playing with Trump, or playing Trump specifically. But help me understand this relationship between the two, or what it is.
So I would think from former President Trump's point of view, he admires strong men, and we certainly know that he admires Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a former KGB agent who used to be a case officer, and he understands how to manipulate people. And from some of the reports we've seen, he knows how to flatter people. He said very flattering things about former President Trump. Former President Trump really likes that. Does Putin view Trump as someone who's a friend? I doubt it. I think this is all instrumental for him, but it's very useful for him. He would like to have a Trump victory in November because he then will see a more chaotic America. So I think there's a great difference between the way that these two men view each other and what they view as the point of their relationship.
Why, in your view, are we not hearing more from members of Congress who might understand that it's an issue, the relationship here, but aren't coming out and saying that, hey, this is the type of thing that, at least in your view, Dr. Sten, is dangerous?
Well, I think we're probably hearing from Democratic members of Congress. They're speaking up. But, as you know, people who elected officials in the Republican Party aren't really saying anything because no one wants to criticize what's happening there. So I think that's probably, but it's not as if no one's talking about this.
All right. So how are you thinking about, man, how many times have we had this conversation, when we might see an end to this war? But here we are, getting ready, as I said, the third winter, and it's just pretty remarkable. Ukrainian President Zelensky saying today he had arrived in Iceland to talk about the Russian invasion with leaders of several Nordic countries, wanting to talk and rally allies around his victory plan. Is a victory anytime soon in your view? And what gets us there and what won't get us there?
Yeah, so I was at a meeting last month in Ukraine, and clearly the Ukrainian leadership is very concerned about the outcome of our own election. Because from what former President Trump has said, he said he'll end the war in 24 hours. We obviously have no idea how he would plan to do that. But I think what we do know, and again, listening to J.D. Vance, is that support for Ukraine would probably end with a Trump victory. Financial support, probably weapons support, and the Ukrainians would be under great pressure to negotiate a settlement with Russia, which really would not be in their interests. That is to say, if former President Trump offers President Putin, who we have to acknowledge has no interest in negotiations at the moment, but if he's offered something that would make it worth his while, and former President Trump has said that would include lifting sanctions against Russia, which of course Trump can't do on his own. There is a U.S. Congress. So I think that's one scenario. And I do think with the Trump victory, the war probably will end sooner. And it will, end with a settlement, if there is a settlement that's not favorable to Ukraine. If there's a Democratic victory, if Vice President Harris wins, then I think you would have a reevaluation of the policy. You'd probably have a continuation of support for Ukraine.
Right.
But I also think there will be less financial support coming from the United States in the next year. So I think either way, we are looking at the possibility of negotiations happening sooner rather than later.
Right.
But the question was, would we have an administration that will give Ukraine more than, than it has at the moment?
Dr. Angela Sten, thank you so much. Always appreciate it. Author of Putin's World and, of course, over at Brookings Institution. This is Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are higher. Traders gearing up for the U.S. election and key economic data that will set the stage for the next Federal Reserve decision. All major groups in the S&P 500 advanced, with the exception of energy shares that joined a plunge in oil. Airlines rallied, and shares of cryptocurrency companies surged, with Bitcoin extending its October gains. Bitcoin now up more than 3% at 69,800. We check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 22 points. NASDAQ up 80 points. The Dow is up 312 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.27%. The 2-year yield at 4.13%. A Bloomberg Markets Live Pulse survey finds most people believe a Trump election victory would help stocks, while a Harris victory would bring more relief to housing costs. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, you can subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec.
Thanks so much for that update. Do appreciate it, Amy. If you never want to miss a Bloomberg Business Week story, become a subscriber today. You'll unlock deep reporting and analysis from our reporters around the world, including unlimited access to Business Week. You can check out our offers right now at Bloomberg.com/subscribe now.
So what did you do over the weekend?
Okay, over the weekend, I voted.
You did vote?
Yeah.
Did early voting?
I did early voting.
Was it
Took the whole family.
Was it busy?
Pretty busy. We went Sunday in Brooklyn.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was actually pretty busy. No joke, as I was filling out the ballot, for some reason I thought back to the 2000. I always think about this when I'm filling out the ballot. I'm like, you have to do it very carefully because you don't want any confusion. Remember the hanging Chad image from the 2000 presidential election?
Oh my God, we talked so much about it back then.
George W. Bush, Al Gore. If you're of a certain age, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the Supreme Court had to determine the outcome of that election. It also took a long time.
It did. Fast forward to this year. The sheer closeness of this year's presidential race makes an election determining Supreme Court showdown a possibility. As Greg Storr writes, though, it just isn't likely. So this is why we wanted to catch up with him. Greg Storr is Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter. He joins us right now from Washington, D.C. Greg, so glad you could come on with us, because we've talked a lot about the potential for litigation in various states over the outcome and the counting of votes and so on and so forth. But why isn't a Supreme Court showdown likely this time around?
Well, Carol, there are a couple reasons. One of them is legal, and one of them is mathematical. The legal issue is that the Supreme Court in recent years has sort of narrowed the scope, narrowed the universe of issues that might actually get there. So there was a case last year, you may recall, it had to do with the power of state legislatures, and in particular, whether the Supreme Court could overrule state Supreme Courts in interpreting their own election laws. And what the Supreme Court said was, we're not going to adopt this theory that says state Supreme Courts don't have any role here. And so that, to some degree, limited the Supreme Court's future involvement. And then the second thing is math. So I am old enough to remember the hanging chads in Bush v. Gore. And that was a fight over 537 votes in a single state that was going to determine the outcome of the election. And unless you have that sort of dynamic, then there's not the opportunity for the Supreme Court, if it wants to get involved, to resolve a single legal issue and effectively resolve the election.
But Greg, at the same time, it doesn't mean there isn't going to be legal challenges regardless of the outcome here. And you write about that. More than 100 lawsuits already that are shaping the 2024 U.S. presidential election. So just because it won't be decided, or I won't say won't, it's unlikely to be decided by the Supreme Court, doesn't mean the lawyers will not be getting paid.
They will be getting paid, and we'll get some things going to the Supreme Court, much like we did in 2020. If you recall, there were a lot of things that came to the Supreme Court. Now, some of those were pandemic related, particular issues involving voting by mail that we hadn't dealt with before. But even after the election, you had that effort, and really an unusual effort by Texas to try to overturn the results in 4 other states, and the Trump campaign threw its weight behind that, and the Supreme Court had no interest in that. We've already got a couple things that have made it to the Supreme Court now. There was something filed today having to do with efforts by Virginia, and of course that's not a swing state, but Virginia is trying to remove about 1,600 people from their voter rolls, and there's a dispute over that. That is now at the Supreme Court. What at this point is probably unlikely is one of these election determining fights like Bush versus Gore.
So this is good? I mean, this is the way things should you know, we're so concerned, or so much has been written about the politicization of the U.S. Supreme Court. So is this a good thing in your view as you watch what may happen and what is expected to be potentially a fair amount of litigation after the election results, depending on the outcome?
I think certainly from the standpoint of the Supreme Court's institutional standing, having them not be involved in the case is a good thing. The Supreme Court took a hit with Bush versus Gore, and of course, the court's been under enormous scrutiny the last few years. You've got the three Trump appointees who have joined the court, made it much more conservative, some really far-reaching rulings like the abortion one, and then all these ethical scandals that have surrounded the court. And the court, every justice likes to say, we don't do politics here, we do law. But any decision that they issue that determines or significantly shapes the outcome of the presidential election undoubtedly is going to look political, and that's not the kind of thing they want.
So it raises the question about how the campaigns are dealing with this ahead of time, given that, and we spoke a couple weeks ago to reporters who around the big take about the way that, Greg, this isn't really how the founders envisioned democracy working, the idea of votes then being litigated or elections being litigated. How are you seeing, and again, you're focusing on the legal side of this. This isn't, we're not talking campaigns here, but we are a week out from the election, more or less. What are the campaigns doing to prepare for the scenarios here?
Well, certainly they are laying legal groundwork. Yes, there are scores of cases that are out there now that potentially could just be, one step away from the Supreme Court if it turns out that I'm wrong, and one of those cases is enough to shift the balance here. So that's one thing. They're making themselves ready. And then the second thing is, both sides have these incredible legal teams that have tried to think through and brief in advance every issue under the sun, so that if it turns out a particular issue is something that they need in a Supreme Court filing that they need to get in within 48 hours, they already have it at the ready. So both sides are ready to go in the event we end up with a Supreme Court showdown. What we won't know for at least a week or so is whether that's going to be necessary.
You finished the piece with a quote, and forgive me, I'm just trying to see who said this. And what you get into, the quote is, you need one state being a tipping point and a very narrow margin of victory, and then you need some kind of hook that gets the Supreme Court's attention. And I do think about that, Greg, about what would ultimately get the Supreme Court's attention here.
Yeah, and so just going back to 2000, you mentioned those hanging chads. That was something that got the Supreme Court's attention. It got everybody's attention, this notion that around the state of Florida, it wasn't clear whether these votes were going to count or not, and they were being judged by individuals who didn't have clear standards. And so that got their attention, and then you add into it the fact that there was, at least officially, a 537 vote margin. And so you would need something like that. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be just one issue, just one hook. It could be a couple of them that add up, but something where there's some dispute where one side can say, hey, those 2,000 votes shouldn't have counted, and that might have been enough to shift the balance. That would be the sort of thing where the Supreme Court pretty much would have to get involved.
Hey, one thing I want to ask you, I think we constantly just default to that the litigation would come from the Trump team, but there is potential that there could be litigation on each side, especially if it's super close, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if imagine a world where, Donald Trump, Pennsylvania is the key state, and Donald Trump wins it by a few hundred votes. Absolutely, the Harris campaign will be looking for ways to challenge. And, part of, most states have provisions. If an election there is exceptionally close, like it was in Florida, there's a provision there that says the loser can challenge the result. And there's a whole process there. And Al Gore's campaign followed that process, and it eventually led to the U.S. Supreme Court. So if there's a state like that is really close, no matter who's on the losing side, you can bet they will ask for a recount if that's allowed, challenge any votes that might be questionable. Ultimately, though, when it gets to the Supreme Court, the question will be, in part, is this a court that's going to, see our side of the issue on one of those things?
Okay, so how sharp is your pencil for next Wednesday in terms of how you're thinking about your job after Election Day?
Well, as the Supreme Court reporter, I have a little bit of a luxury that almost everything goes through a couple lower courts beforehand. So, some other colleagues will be following cases at the lower court level. That's where it will start to play out, and the Supreme Court probably will stay its hand. Now, you mentioned how long Bush v. Gore went along. That was decided on December the 12th. The Supreme Court agreed to take that particular case up on December the 9th. So, quite a lot had happened between, when the last vote was cast on Election Day and when the Supreme Court jumped in that case. And so there's, different cases, different elections will play out different ways, but it's certainly very, very possible that any Supreme Court involvement, should it happen in this election, won't happen for a number of weeks.
Interesting stuff. Like I said, how many times have we said interesting this year when it comes to the U.S. election?
Do we talk about Elon Musk at all?
Go
and
ahead.
the Musk giveaways?
Oh, go ahead.
Greg?
Yeah, we should get Greg to weigh in on
I'm
this.
curious how you're
We've talked about
thinking
it.
about this. There's certainly President Biden commented on it earlier in the day, but from a legal standpoint, from your perch, how are you watching these giveaways?
Well, there are certainly questions about those. I'm not going to pretend like I know what the answer is, but to the extent money is going to people because they are only to people who have registered to vote, there are questions about whether that is legal. Now, that being said, I'm not yet sure how that would translate to something that would determine who wins or who loses in this case, into something that is, Trump v. Harris-like. But it is certainly an issue worth watching. I am quite sure that the Harris campaign is thinking about this and how they might use it if they need to make an argument in court.
Unbelievable. All right. So appreciate it. Like we said, the twists and turns that are part of the U.S. presidential election cycle this time around. Greg Storr, thank you so much. Supreme Court reporter at Bloomberg News joining us from Washington, D.C. Hey, folks, we're just about 26 minutes away from the closing bell on Wall Street on this Monday, and we're looking at about a 25-point gain on the S&P 500, so up 0.4 of a percentage point. The Dow up 339 points, so up 0.8%, some outperformance there. Transports, a good reason why we're seeing some gains on the Dow. Energy, too. And the NASDAQ 100, Tim, just up about 0.2%. No surprise considering the mega cap tech names that are reporting this week. What is it, like 40%?
42%, yeah.
Of the U.S. market cap, S&P market cap.
You mentioned transports. We got Ford earnings after the bell today.
Yeah, playing into that, right?
Yeah.
Planes, trains, and automobiles.
This is the automobiles portion of the planes, trains, and automobiles movie.
All right, Carol Master, Tim Stanovic, we're coming back on Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks moving higher. From the First Word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call, here's Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Amy. That's right. U.S. stocks with a bid right now, with the Dow currently up 336 points. S&P's gained 26, and the Nasdaq is higher by 0.5%. The U.S. 10-year yield of 4.27%. Gold is lower by 5. Oil is sinking today, but Bitcoin, that's higher by 3.2%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were financials and utilities. Only energy was in the red, and leaders to the upside in the Dow, 3M and Goldman Sachs, while Boeing fell 1.9% and led to the downside. In the tech space, the information reported that Facebook is developing an AI search engine. And wrapping things up, some of the names reporting up to the bell tonight include Ford and F5. Live from the First Breaking News Desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Amy?
All right, thank you, Bill. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, TikTok, everybody. About 18 and a half minutes to go until we wrap up the Friday trading session. Does feel like, we're seeing definitely some enthusiasm. We're going to get into some of the sectors and the winners and losers, I should say, a little bit later on. I'm just looking
I like to think of them as decliners, not losers, but thank you for bringing that up.
What is it, like the Academy Award? And the winner is?
Yeah.
Can't even say that anymore.
You get the winners, I get the runners-up.
Almost 400 names, 376 names in the S&P 500 higher today, 127 to the downside.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing some strength when it comes to the equity market today. More buyers than sellers. Let's see what our Drive to the Close guest has to say about this. Back with us is David Bahnsen, CIO over at the Bahnsen Group. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. What do you make of this relentless move higher?
Well, I think a lot of things are getting quite stretched, and that valuation story has kind of confounded things all year long. You have expensive things getting more expensive. You do not have organic earnings growth. They already priced in really robust earnings growth, and it's lived up to it, but it's not going above and beyond that, yet valuations are expanding.
So if you're getting new money right now, how are you putting it to work if things are expensive?
So we're not index investors and we're not big tech investors. And so within a dividend growth, very concentrated portfolio, we never own more than about 30 companies at a time. We think there's good pockets of value in some of consumer staples. We've had a very good year in both financials and even energy. Energy as a sector hasn't done well, but midstream has done quite well and is still really well valued. But we also are going in slowly. We're tethering. If we're getting brand new cash in, we're not putting every dollar of it to work on day one.
How much new cash are you bringing in?
How much new cash are we bringing in terms of just new monies that come in?
Yeah.
Well, we bring in anywhere from $50 to $100 million a month of new money every month.
Is that pretty regular? I'm just curious if it's different from what you've seen over the last 6 months or so.
It's been very consistent for us for a few years now. A bad month is 50, a good month is 120, and right now we're kind of tethering it in. And again, some of the more undervalued things, if we get a company that has disappointing earnings, it gives us a chance to add more. So what you guys are calling the losers of the decliners, that's what we like. We like those things when they take a check back.
Where's the new money coming from?
Well, look, there's still a lot of M&A activity. We've had a lot of clients that have sold businesses. You have a lot of people that have had bonds and different things mature. The one thesis I don't agree with is money market balance and all this cash on the side.
More than $6 trillion.
I don't think that money's coming back into equities.
Where do you think it's going to go?
Bonds. I think most of it was either reserve savings money that was previously zero interest deposit that went to money market to get a little yield, or it came out of the bond market where you could get rid of duration risk and get the same yield.
I wonder why that number keeps getting higher.
I think a lot of it is because people are confusing bank deposit and money market, that you had a lot of money market, which is really short-term T-bills, commercial paper, and it just became a surrogate for bonds because after 2022, which 23 is when bulk of this money moved, and you had the risk at Silicon Valley Bank and some of those things, money markets are paying 5.5% yields. People said, well, bonds are down 10%, 15%. Why do I need to go into bonds? I can go to money market and get a higher yield. So it just kind of reallocated a lot of that positioning.
In terms of Treasury, and you look at the U.S. yield curve, I mean, do you think that we could once again test 5% here, potentially on the 10%?
On the 10-year, I do not know. I mean, obviously you could, but it would not be our thesis. I think that, look, there's been very little move up in tip spreads at all. It's been entirely real GDP expectations. So the real growth expectations are not good enough to get the 10-year up to 5%. If it did, I wouldn't see it as a negative because it's not coming from higher inflation expectations. It's coming from higher real growth expectations. And I think that it's gotten quite stretched here. We were at 370. It's gotten up to the 425, 430. I would be very surprised if it goes much above 450, but that's because I'm long-term bearish on structural growth. The 10-year does not measure the Fed. Every day I'm hearing someone say, why if the Fed's cutting is the 10-year going higher? The Fed can't control the long end of the curve.
No, it's the shorter end of the yield curve.
The short end is all they can control. The 10-year really does price in trillions of dollars of real people's expectations for nominal GDP growth. Inflation isn't moving. Real growth has moved up a bit.
But doesn't the longer end of the yield curve potentially also factor in what the U.S. government does in terms of debt on their balance sheet? And that is something that, once again, for those of us who have been around a long time, we remember all those arguments and concerns about the deficit, and then it went away, and now it's back again.
And this is where I'm a contrarian from the lessons of Japan and the lessons of the U.S. for 15 years after our own financial crisis. I do not believe that growing deficits pushes the yields higher, puts downward pressure on yields because it suppresses growth. And so Japan went to 250% debt to GDP and ended up with negative yields forever. Central banks manipulate and intervene at that stage, but the point being that real growth expectations go lower, not higher, from increased deficit spending. We're far past the point of a multiplier on this fiscal stimulus.
I want to talk a little bit about a comment from Ed Yardeni a little earlier today on Bloomberg TV. He talked about bond vigilantes mustering as the U.S. and the U.K. prep debt sales. Are you concerned about a potential return of bond vigilantes?
No, I'm kind of amused that we're talking about 30 or 40 basis points. So that's supposed to be bond vigilantes. The 10-year has come all the way up to 4.3%, which is still 70, 75 basis points less than it was a year ago. There's no bond vigilantes. Now, Ed, his defense, who's a brilliant guy and a friend, he's talking about the potential for it to happen. But again, the bond vigilante thesis has been out there since post-financial crisis. We've run up these deficits, and it has done nothing but put downward pressure on bond yields.
That said, this election, what happens if one of these parties sweeps and they get this blank check to spend? Either both can't. I don't care who you're talking about. They're both talking about spending a lot of money.
Neither candidate is going to have a blank check to spend what they want. Even, first of all, I think it's very unlikely that Harris ends up with a Democrat House and Senate. It would be a real miracle for her to win and have the Senate move in that direction. But let's say she has a 50-50 control. There's one or two Democrats that won't approve a lot of the spending as well. In Trump's case, a lot of the projections for deficit blowouts have to do more with the lost revenue side than increased spending. I still think he'll spend a lot. I don't think he minds spending or big debt and deficits, but the red side of the Senate and House, I think, will have to hold him in. They won't to the degree I need us to. All we're debating is whether or not the deficit goes up $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion. But the biggest thing that's going to bring deficits down a few $100 billion is rates coming lower. The term structure of Treasury debt is so loaded to the short end of the curve that if you go from a 5% T-bill to a 2 or 3% T-bill, you're pulling out hundreds of billions of dollars of debt service cost. That's going to be some of the relief there.
What do you make of a lost decade in stocks? You know that this has been something everybody's been kicking around. David Kostin of Goldman Sachs, chief U.S. equity strategist, published a paper. And basically what he said is suggesting the index, S&P 500, will gain only 3% in nominal terms, 1% in real terms per year over the next decade, which would be one of the worst on record. You buy that?
Completely, but I feel like he plagiarized it from me, but I'm joking. David Kostin is brilliant. His name almost rhymes with David Bahnsen, and I've been saying this for several years. I believe the post-crisis bull market ended in November 2021, and we started at that point a period of what effectively could be a lost decade. I think he said 3% real growth, and I could see it 4 or 5, but
3% nominal, 1% in real.
Right, that will feel like a lost decade to most people, even if you get, let's say, 3% real, 5% nominal. model. Even then, you're talking about a tiny fraction of what investors got used to. Investors aren't even right now prepared for historical returns, 9 or 10 in the S&P. They're used to 14 or 15, and they're used to 14 or 15 without down years along the way.
Well, some would say that about rates. This is, historically more normal than what we've
But
seen
you
over
just
the last decade or
cannot get
so.
the earnings growth, and you certainly can't get the multiple expansion to make that possible.
All right, David Bahnsen, thank you so much, CIO of the Bahnsen Group, joining us right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Folks, we're coming up on 11 minutes to go in the trade. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, about 7 minutes, really about 6.5 minutes to go until we wrap up the trading day on this Monday. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenivek. We're going to head over to our TV colleagues in just a moment. Got some earnings, too, after the closing bell. You've got Ford, you've got VFC Corporation. So, not VFC. VFC is the ticker.
VF
Corporation. Is the company. So we're going to break down those earnings as soon as they cross. And then it becomes to earnings when you think about the big tech companies, whether it's Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet. Am I leaving anybody out?
Meta Platforms.
Meta
did you
Platforms,
mention?
I forgot
I'm
that
just looking at the VF Corp brands.
Yeah.
North Face, Vans, Timberland,
Dickies,
Icebreaker, JanSport, Smart Wool, Kipling, and more.
Yeah. So we're going to get into that, right?
Yeah, we'll do that.
Cool stuff. Cool stuff.
What's on your radar?
What is on my radar? I don't know. I'm just, I feel like, we've just got so much coming at us. I'm just looking at what's the most.
Ooh, this Starbucks story and the most read in the last hour.
Oh,
Elizabeth, you said this earlier, didn't you?
Well, I saw it come across the
Okay.
Bloomberg as an alert. It's the most read story on the Bloomberg in the last 60 minutes. Go there. Go. You start.
Okay, Starbucks is telling its corporate staff that they could be fired if they don't come to the office at least 3 days a week.
So much for being flexible, everybody.
3 days? That is flexible.
Oh,
Are you
yeah,
kidding?
that's true.
3 days a week? Come on. What year
Says
is
Tim,
this?
who's
I'm
here.
sorry. 3 days a week. So
Starting in January, Starbucks will implement a standardized process to hold workers accountable if they do not abide by the coffee chain's return to office policy, according to a memo sent to one of the company's divisions that was seen by Bloomberg News. Consequences are, quote, up to and including separation, according to the email.
what's the way to say you get divorced but separate? Like, what's the way? Conscious uncoupling? Yeah, maybe we'll do a conscious uncoupling with you as an employee.
This isn't conscious uncoupling. This is called
a
bye.
separation.
See ya.
The message marks an escalation in enforcement of the company's hybrid work rules less than 2 months since Brian Niccol took over as CEO. He told employees last month they should work wherever they need to in order to get their jobs done, but that he thought the place was usually the office. Come on.
Yeah.
You know what, though, too?
What?
I think people need to remember.
What?
Starbucks caters to a group of people who go to work in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be.
So-
well, for those who have to be at the stores, the restaurants.
No. What I'm saying is,
what are you saying?
Starbucks customers.
Yeah.
What happens if you work from home? You don't go out and get coffee. You make
might.
coffee at home.
You might. No.
I
don't know. Yeah. No.
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
I didn't. But that was the pandemic.
Yeah, I think Starbucks locations do better, and we saw this during the pandemic.
Yeah.
When people are going to the office, when people are going to city centers.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
So,
I mean,
don't they want everyone to be going to work all the time?
yeah, they do.
You know, it's like working for it's like my friends who work for
You
commercial.
mean they're talking
real
their
estate.
book?
Yes, but is it kind of crazy that they're talking their book now and they haven't been talking their book for 4 years? For example, my friends who work in commercial real estate.
Yeah.
Guess what?
What?
They go to the office every day.
Because they,
Because they work in commercial real
Offices.
estate. Yes.
It's hard to say, listen, you got to go back to office. We're selling you office if they're not there.
But we only work, hybrid.
Well, this policy applies to about 3,500 corporate employees. Most of the company's workers, though, are employed at its stores, so we know that. And the company put out a statement, to be fair, we like to be fair. We are continuing to support our leaders as they hold their teams accountable to our existing hybrid work policy. Yeah. Starbucks, the latest, though, to kind of shift from carrots to sticks in the ongoing RTO, return to office battle that has been playing out at workplaces. Remember when we were having conversations and leaders were like, nah, we're going to be flexible.
They went from frappuccinos to egg bites.
Yeah, exactly.
No carrots or sticks, right?
Yeah, exactly. No carrot. No.
Frappuccinos and egg bites.
No, it's just, yeah. It's
What do you
tough.
think?
I don't know.
Those poor workers having to go in 3 days a week.
All I would say that I kind of get it if I'm a leader, and I would say that to understand a company and its culture, and I do think you have to be at the office.
And remember,
maybe there's a flexible, it doesn't have to be all week, but
the challenge here is for Brian Niccol, who lives in Orange County, California, and commutes up to Seattle in the private jet. That's the challenge. What does he do when making people come in 3 days a week? And Starbucks has tried to deal with that, and they're dealing with that.
Yeah.
Just throwing it out there.
Just throwing it out there. Something to think about maybe on your ride home. But don't go anywhere yet because we're heading over to our TV colleagues. Closing bell starts now.
Right now.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close, starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic alongside Scarlett Fu. We're taking you through the closing bell with a global simulcast that starts right now. Carol Massar and Tim Stenovic joining us from the radio booth as we welcome our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, including our partnership here with YouTube. A big rebound here in the equity markets, Carol Massar, though very much heavily weighted towards small and mid-cap stocks.
Yeah, kind of interesting, right, to see that trade. I've been thinking, though, a lot about the energy trade. You had crude oil went down more than 5%. You've seen energy names lower. But what has rallied off of that is your cruise line names, your airline stocks, anybody who taps into the energy market, which is kind of a big line on the balance sheet, that energy cost, they have definitely been benefiting in today's trade.
We're kind of talking our gainers and decliners here because I got to tell you, kind of tough to find decliners, but look no further than energy to find decliners. The worst performing sector in the S&P 500, all tracking this drop in Brent after those Israeli strikes against targets in Iran avoided those crude facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking as well, with oil prices plunging, how that kind of removes some of the inflation fears that, had taken hold in this market. But I feel like the Fed is kind of the last thing on people's minds, at least for this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And thankfully, they're in a quiet period, so we don't need to worry too much about them. But this is kind of the 1-2 punch, right? I mean, 1-2-3 punch, if you will, here with earnings really heating up this week, the busiest week of earnings. That's going to be followed by more earnings next week, the election, then, of course, the Fed decision on a week from Thursday.
It's a lot coming out of investors. 42%, right, of the S&P 500's market cap coming your way in regards to earnings. So it's a big one this week.
Absolutely. And we get the closing bells here in New York. You can take a look there at Walmart actually ringing the bell there on the NYSE floor with stocks pretty much green across the screen here. We're up about 0.3% right now on the S&P 500, about 0.7% on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, while the NASDAQ Composite holding on to the gains of about 0.25%. We should just point out the NASDAQ 100 right now looks like it's going to close out the day unchanged after spending a good portion of the session in the green. But let's go to your outperformers on the day. That includes Dow Transports up 1%, S&P 400 mid-caps up 1%, and the Russell 2000 up 1.6.
All right, going back to the large caps, the big caps, the S&P 500, most names in the index higher today, guys. 355 to be exact, 148 to the downside, Scarlett.
All right, let's take a look at the industry groups. You have 9 out of 11 groups in the green, so a lot of green on that pie there. Financials leading the way, gaining more than 1%. Materials and utilities are the next best performers, and the red spot there is really belongs to energy, down 2/3% as oil prices tumble, and tech slightly down.
All right, guys, to the individual gainers we go, and taking a look at Trump Media and Technology Group, up pretty much closing just off its highs of the session, up more than 21%, extending a 5-week surge that has put the stock up some 270% from a September 26 low. We had a lot of retail traders out there touting the shares, betting markets like Polymarket on Trump returning to the White House, and so those increased odds. There's a lot of conversation, certainly on social media, and as I said, the retail trade, so really pushing that name up. We mentioned the pullback in terms of oil prices, and so you've seen a lot of travel names, transportation names higher in today's session. That included Carnival Cruise, up nearly 5% in today's session. And then I do want to just mention Dow Jones Transports, because you had most names in the index higher today. The index overall up about 1.2%. Quick check here on the index, and you had 16 of the 20 names higher in today's session, again, as we've seen that restrained response from Israel against Iran, and that has put some pressure on energy prices.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the decliners, including energy companies. I'll get to those in just a second. But starting with Boeing, shares fell after the company launched nearly $19 billion share sale. It's one of the largest ever by a public company, offering to sell 90 million common shares and about $5 billion of depository shares. That's according to a statement that came out today. The common share portion alone would total just under $14 billion. Shares of Boeing falling today by 2.8%. Could raise up to about $22 billion, according to Bloomberg calculations. And on to one of the energy companies I want to focus on, APA Corporation falling 4.5% today. We mentioned why oil fell. We saw oil companies move as a result of that. The S&P 500 Energy Index dropping as much as 1.9% in the session, hitting its lowest level since October 1st. It was the worst performing, as Scarlett mentioned, of the 11 sectors in the market. APA led those declines today, falling 4.5%. And finally, GE Healthcare Technology today fell 2.8%. We saw weakness as a result of Philips shares plunging the most intraday since September of 1998. The medical tech firm reported third quarter sales that missed expectations. It also lowered its comp sales forecast for the year. We saw GE Health shares fall in sympathy there.
All right, let's take a quick look at yields up again for another day here. Fifth session in the past 6, where we've seen yields move higher, defying a lot of expectations that we were going to see a much more meaningful drop. In fact, on that benchmark 10-year yield of 3 basis points today to 4.27, that's the highest level going back to late July. Similar story for your 2-year yield, up about 2 to 3 basis points on the day, but again at 4.129 and change. That's the highest level since at least August 1st here, and that is the trajectory right now, and it's a big part of the reason why we kicked off the close here on Bloomberg Television a little bit earlier with a big focus on those Treasury yields and Treasury borrowing.
All right, guys, as we wait for some earnings after the close today, I want to get to one that's going to actually report earnings tomorrow. We're talking about Crocs. This one has been on a tear this year, up about 48%. Well, You know, what's interesting is, as this company has focused on a younger generation to wear their shoes, it turns out schools are kind of pushing back, and they're starting to ban. Dozens of schools in at least 12 U.S. states have forbidden students from wearing Crocs in their day-to-day use, and their concerns are that students are tripping and falling.
It's not just tripping and falling. Other schools have say the shoes have led to a rise in accidents and distractions, students playing with the little charms that go with the shoes in class. They have thrown shoes at classmates before.
I'm sorry, this is separate from Crocs now at this point then, right?
No, I mean, I think you throw a Croc because maybe it wouldn't hurt as bad if it hit you. But
again,
there's
bigger
also,
issues.
There's also, Julia Fanzeris wrote this story. It's a great piece. There's a scary anecdote in here about a young person actually getting a shoe stuck in an escalator.
Ooh.
And then getting a pretty severe injury as a result of that. I don't know if you guys are.
That
Are you
could
guys
happen
wearing?
with a lot of shoes, though. A shoelace could get caught.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't understand though. Is this different from just regular shoes?
Yeah, the argument from these school nurses is that they're not as safe as a traditional regular shoe.
Okay.
Yeah, not as safe as, the New
I
Balance.
feel like this is the 2024 version of when I wasn't allowed to wear Keds sneakers during gym class because everyone took out the laces and it wasn't really a sneaker.
Well, and I guess if you don't put the strap on the back, I remember clogs being banned, like in grade school or something, because people were tripping and falling or something.
They call it the safety strap, Carol.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just thought it was interesting that there's a safety strap on a Crocs.
Maybe there's a problem to begin with. I'm just going to say.
All right, we do have some breaking news here. Let's just start off here with Ross Stores as we wait for earnings across the wire on forward. A new CEO over at that company who knew they were looking. They've now found one. James Conroy is going to be the new CEO at Ross Stores. That's just crossing the wire right now. This will take effect on February 2nd of next year as Barbara Rentler steps down.
Boot Barn Holdings CEO. He's coming from Boot Barn, so he's stepping down from Boot Barn, going over to Ross Stores.
Can you say that again?
I said it once. It's enough.
Boot Barn.
Boot Barn. Yeah.
Boot Barn. All right, what do you guys got for us?
There's a story about, hold on, let me just pull it up because it was a really good one, about JP Morgan warning people that there's going to be a water shortage because of AI power demand. Obviously, to keep data centers cool, you need a lot of water, and that is going to collide with less reliable precipitation patterns due to climate change. If you're in the East Coast or in the New York area, it hasn't rained here for almost a month, which is kind of unusual for this time of the year.
Makes me feel like we're home. Makes me feel like California.
Oh, yeah.
I've been wondering.
For better, for worse.
Yeah. Here's a stat. Large data centers can use as much as 5 million gallons of water a day. That's a lot.
All right, let's get to earnings here, as quite a few are crossing the wires that we need to get to. VF Corp, of course, the owner of North Face, reporting operating income in the most recent quarter on an adjusted basis of roughly about $273.9 million. That's above street estimates of $219.5 million, and the company also saying that its revenue from continuing ops basically coming in right in line with estimates. EPS also a slight beat. The shares higher, Carol, up about 3%.
All right, guys, let's get to another one crossing Cadence Design, and let's get right to the outlook. Fiscal year adjusted EPS of $5.80 to $5.93. That is it had seen $5.77 to $5.97. Fiscal year revenue $4.61 to $4.65. It had seen $4.6 to $4.66 billion. And I'm just taking a look. Stock investors seem to like it, at least at first blush. Stock is up about 8.6% here in the aftermarket.
All right, I'm looking at shares of Ford, which are bouncing around but higher in the after hours. The company sees fiscal year adjusted EBIT coming in at $10 billion. They saw it from $10 billion to $12 billion. The estimate was for 10.6, so that came in a little light. Third quarter adjusted EPS, though, coming in line with expectations at 49 cents. Shares now down about 1%.
And this is a stock that's fallen almost 10% this year, and since its last earnings, down 18% because of that higher than expected surge in warranty costs. A lot of eyeballs on whether it's going to turn things around on that side. Another headline that just crossed in terms of its outlook for Ford Blue, which is its traditional ICE vehicles. EBITDA will be $5 billion for the full year. It had seen $6 to $6.5 billion, so that is a downgrade on its outlook for its biggest business.
And it's kind of interesting, too. I mean, just real quickly, guys, because there's a lot in this here, and they really do talk about this idea of cost controls as that being the big driver going forward for what those earnings are going to look like. The company saying that it has a lot to share, not just in the release, but on that conference call as well. We're going to continue our coverage on Bloomberg Television in just a minute.
Yeah, and that forecast in particular remain dragging down the stock down about 4% here in the aftermarket. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Our cross-platform radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Ford shares down about 3% in the after hours right now. The company sees capex from $8 billion to $8.5 billion. They saw $8 to $9 billion. The estimate came in at $8.39 billion. The Ford Blue EBIT coming in shy of expectations. That's the traditional ICE part of the business coming in at $5 billion. They saw $6 billion to $6.5 billion. So investors certainly sending shares lower right now in the after hours.
Yeah, well, we will continue to unpack that and watch for some commentary, certainly on the analyst call. In the meantime, don't forget, of course, it's a huge week for AI and for NVIDIA, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, and Meta platforms. We've talked about this over the last couple of hours, all reporting earnings in the coming days. Traders will be paying close attention to their CapEx spending to gauge demand for NVIDIA's chips, which are prized for AI computing. It's something we kind of kicked off at 2 p.m.
Yeah, so NVIDIA's not reporting this week, but what we learned from these companies is how much demand there is for NVIDIA given their CapEx, right?
These are their main customers,
Yeah.
right? The bulk of what NVIDIA sells comes from these guys.
Well, I know Matt Olson's going to be watching this stuff closely. He's Chief Innovation Officer over at Burns & McDonnell. It's an employee-owned engineering, architecture, construction, and environmental and consulting firm. It plays in a host of industries: aviation infrastructure, healthcare, military construction, consumer product manufacturing, food and beverage production, oil, gas, and chemicals, renewable energy, telecom, and more. He joins us here.
It's a snapshot of the world.
It is, well, all over the world, too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Welcome, how are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's an exciting day, beautiful day here in New York.
It is a nice day here in New York. Hasn't rained in a while, which is very
little
weird,
dry,
but
yeah.
it's all good. Okay, so the frenzy around AI in public markets, how has that affected your job over the last couple of years?
Yeah, a couple different ways. We play in two aspects of that market. One, building the infrastructure.
Data centers.
Data centers, the power grid. Two things massively impacted by the deployment of AI, but then also on the need for our resources and our actual deployment of AI within our business.
When you say resources, do you actually mean the production of electricity?
More the number of people we need that keep up with the market demand. Can we attract enough talent? Is there enough people graduating to execute all the work? The projects are bigger, moving faster than ever before. And we've had to look for ways, as we're bringing more renewable energy onto the grid, we're dealing with a more complex situation. It's not just a few big plants anymore. It's sources all over the place. And so that means more planning, more construction projects, more things to engage with, and that requires more human capital to make that happen. And something that we have in decent supply, but we could always use more of here in the U.S.
Well, tell us about that. Like, what are you looking for in hires, in new hires? What kind of backgrounds are you looking for?
Experienced people with engineering over almost any discipline, a lot in the
Any
space
kind of
that
engineers, or are you looking for?
Any kind generally. In my space specifically, electrical, computer, data scientist roles and responsibilities are prime. However, with the availability of labor, we are cross-training people if they do not necessarily have the background in that space, because we're looking to always be adding to our ranks.
Matt, I'm wondering, are you concerned about the presidential election outcome and what it might mean for immigration, and especially those with the skills that you might be interested in and maybe are? I don't know how much of your talent pool comes from outside the United States. I mean, you guys are operating around.
We do projects worldwide. We're, with the presidential election, fortunately, in the infrastructure business, it runs on very long time cycles.
Yeah.
So immediate impacts, not 100% clear to, projects that we're working on now, we'll be working on for the next 18 to 24 months. The key things are that we keep that project pipeline working effectively, that regulation, that permits are getting approved, to keep our construction backlog strong and be able to let us complete all the projects that everybody wants to be completed. Infrastructure, something that's the forefront of everybody's mind. It's something that we used to not talk a lot about, but
when you say infrastructure, is it data centers or what else? Like, what infrastructure covers so much? People can think bridges, but it can mean so much more.
It is.
So I'm curious.
All of those items for Burns & McDonnell, it's across all that space. It's anything that we depend on, from water and wastewater, roads and bridges, My specific discipline is mostly in the electrical space, so the power grid and the data centers, the fiber optic and telecommunications infrastructure that ties those resources together. It used to be if you wanted power, you called up the electric utility and you made your interconnection request, and your service would be provided some months later, maybe a year later. Now that's not always clear that that's going to happen in the marketplace. That we're now in the space where we're having to really look at what can the grid support, where is available energy, and then that is one of the primary factors in where we're citing data centers. And the scale and the speed of these projects is just getting larger and much faster.
If you think about this like a chain with a weakest link, where is the weakest link right now? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the grid? What the grid can actually handle? Are there areas of the country that can't accommodate what needs will be desired for data centers, for electrical consumption?
Yes, I see the biggest challenge is maybe timescales. It's that we can do a lot with the infrastructure that we have, with the grid that we have, but matching up what is the source, the super interesting thing about AI and data centers, a continuous demand for energy, with what are the sources available in that space, and then what is the interconnecting capacity coming through the grid. So
is the
do all
continuous
those
demand
exist in one place?
Yeah, but is the continuous demand portion the tough part? Because the way that demand has worked has been so based on the time of day traditionally.
Yeah, I think traditionally the energy grid has been a demand-driven infrastructure. Whatever the demand is, we'll build the supply to meet it. With renewable energy coming a bigger and bigger portion, we don't always, we'll say that it's consistent, but it can be intermittent, that we have to, how are we going to put that puzzle together on any given day? And the most efficient thing is, can we move the load around to match, can we charge your car when we have an excess supply? Challenging thing with data centers is generally they are a continuous load, although some technology providers are now looking at how could we change that up? Does it make sense to follow the sun around the world with our compute loads, or only compute certain things? And an interesting dichotomy when you're looking at the cost of buying all those chips, building all those data centers versus the supply of energy. Which one, how's that going to be balanced out, and which one is going to win at any given time? We always want our tweets faster and our text messages. We're not a patient society anymore. So how are we going to balance that with just frankly, infrastructure takes a while. People come and they have an expectation. Oh, well, why can't you just get that for us done in a couple of months? And you're like, there's a few things involved.
So we've done so many stories about our grid being, overtaxed and it needs to build out. I am wondering, I'm thinking about our audience who are listening, it's an investing audience. From your vantage point, what do they need to understand when it comes to our grid and our power needs? I get the data center, and we're all investing, it's all wonderful. But
I think the biggest perspective that I have is we're trying to do multiple things all at once. We have an asset, it's a very large, complex system that took us a century to build. And now in the next, depending on which time scale you want, whether or not you're talking 2030, 2045, 2050, we want to reduce our carbon component to that. We want to make it more resilient, and we want it to support an additional load, and we want to decarbonize heating, and we want to change transportation.
And do it yesterday.
And that is a lot of things to be done in one piece of infrastructure at the same time. So how do we balance all those priorities?
Are you announcing your presidential campaign right now?
We've got the grid to take care of right now.
Matt Olson, Chief Innovation Officer at Burns & McDonnell. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
It's 421 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks closed higher. Energy and oil tapped the brakes on any stronger gains, though. We bring you closing numbers every day here at Bloomberg. The Dow gained 273 points. NASDAQ up 49. The S&P up 15. Ford cut the top end of its full-year earnings forecast as the car maker struggles to cut costs and overhaul its electric vehicle strategy. Ford shares 4.6% lower now in the post-market. Ross Stores have a new CEO. James Conroy will join the company in December as CEO-elect. Then he'll join the board of directors at the same time. His tenure actually begins in February. Starbucks is telling its corporate staff they could be fired if they don't come back to work at the office 3 days a week. Starting in January, Starbucks will implement a standardized process to hold workers accountable if they don't abide by their coffee chain's return to office policy. That's according to a memo sent to one of the company's divisions, seen by Bloomberg News. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stennebeck.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that update. Really do appreciate it. If you never want to miss a Bloomberg Business Week story, become a subscriber today. You'll unlock deep reporting and analysis from reporters around the world, including unlimited access to Business Week. You can check out our offers right now at Bloomberg.com/subscribe now. Is this something that happened in college for you, Carol? There were these courses?
I'm listening.
Okay. So there were these certain classes in college that were like designed to weed people out. Okay?
Yeah, I know exactly.
Psychology, Intro to Psych was one of them because everyone wanted to major in psychology. So what they did was even if you took AP Psych and you got a 5, you still had to take Intro to Psychology, and they made it a terrible class. So only the hardcore students would stick with it. Also, organic chemistry.
Organic chemistry. I did not take that in college.
This was like, you're not going to be a doctor unless
Did you take it in college?
God, no.
Okay.
No. No. I
was like, what?
But it was notorious for weeding people out. Like, you want to become a doctor, you can't do it until you take OChem.
I have this conversation with my daughter who has a friend that's pre-med, and she said, they make these classes really hard so that they absolutely weed out and figure out who's really going to be serious. And
sometimes I go to the doctor and I'm like, you really passed OChem? You did? They didn't weed you out along the way?
Pass fail. You know what they call
No offense.
What do they say?
The person who
a doctor got all D's or pre-med.
Yeah.
All right. We've got a great guest, though, to really maybe make you think differently about students taking science courses. And so let's get to him.
We got Hosea Nelson there because he thinks there's a better way. He's professor of chemistry at California Institute of Technology. He runs the Nelson Lab. The lab calls itself, quote, a multidisciplinary research group. It's focused on developing the next generation tools for organic chemistry. Hosea joins us from Pasadena, California. Also with us is Janet Lauren. She's a Bloomberg News higher education finance reporter. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio.
And Janet, we need to say thank you because Hosea comes to us courtesy of you. Just tell us how he came to your attention.
We had met at a dinner, and he was talking about teaching chemistry and the challenges of teaching and learning. And we were talking about this, and I said, wow, this would be a great guest on Bloomberg Radio.
And you are so right. So, Hosea, come on in on that. So, this whole concept of like weeding people out, wrong?
Absolutely wrong. And I think I'll stand here in front of everyone and on behalf of all organic chemists apologize for taking that strategy towards education because it doesn't really serve education well, I don't think.
That's interesting because
What?
If there's a way to do this, it's no matter how you slice it, this is difficult stuff. And I think that's why it is, sort of used to weed people out. But is it difficult because we don't have the right education getting into college, Hosea? Or is it difficult because the way it's taught, it's not taught in a way that is digestible based on the way that we understand the way people learn?
I think it's a little bit of both. And, I think that a major challenge is organic chemistry represents a wealth of knowledge across all sorts of scientific disciplines. And we tend to, when we teach it, kind of introduce all of those things at once. There's 3 different ways to look at this problem, and instead of kind of building people up and giving them the foundation they need to progress through those 3 different ways of looking at the problem, a lot of times we just kind of throw it all towards them in the beginning. And, I think you guys alluded to it in your discussion that perhaps, there's been a sentiment amongst organic chemists and scientists that there's some sort of bar that we need to place in front of students, to decide who has the necessary tools to move to the next level, instead of thinking about it as education. Hey, we need to educate future doctors so they know a little bit about organic chemistry so they can learn biochemistry and medicine, if that makes any sense.
So can you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you decided you wanted to be a scientist and progressed to become a chemist and doing what you're doing in your lab?
Yeah, and the reason I'm really passionate about education is because of this. So I actually failed high school chemistry not once but twice, and actually ended up dropping out of high school. And then eventually I found a well-paying lab technician summer program or summer job, and did that and fell in love with experimental science and working in a laboratory and making discoveries. Because as it turns out, the chemistry or the science we learn in the class is very different than the practice of doing science or the practice of chemistry.
Why did that not turn you off when you failed chemistry in school? Because I think that is the quickest way for people to be turned off from something. I didn't do well in every subject, and I was turned off by stuff I didn't do well in.
And you're turned off, and then there's a narrative that forms around you of like, well, maybe you're just not a chemistry type of person or something.
Yeah, I think that is true, and to be honest, I was turned off and did not pursue my science education or education at all subsequent to that, and so I think one of the challenges that we face as educators is thinking about how to engage people and kind of give people value and personal validation that goes beyond memorizing the letters associated with orbitals or doing a calculation. And so a lot of what we do now is try to relate. And actually, it's a primary goal when I'm in the classroom is we try to really relate what we're doing in the class to bigger societal problems or bigger personal problems. How does chemistry and science impact medicine? How does the screen of the iPhone you're working on right now in the middle of class, how is that fueled by science? And so I think we need to do a much better job in that regard.
Well, of course, you're at Caltech, where students are well beyond, basic science. But how do you make it interesting to people who are maybe thinking this could be something for me, but I'm not very good in math or I'm not very good in science, and to sort of bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. I think that one of the things in a classroom, if you really want to reach people, you kind of have to meet people where they are. I think traditionally in science, a lot of times we spend our time, putting out an ideal preparation level. And if people don't meet that preparation level and they don't do well in the course, well, it's the problem with the person. But the facts are the facts, and the students we have are the students, and their education level is their education level. So we really have to meet them in that regard. And I still am convinced that making our lessons and our curricula bigger than the very fine details of a subject matter is really, really important in bringing people along.
I think about education too, and I think about, sometimes we're just so taught to, to tests or testing. And the whole idea of, I don't know, it's been an interesting year between, I don't want to get political, but the war between Israel and Hamas and, students trying to protest and they couldn't. And we often have a conversation in the newsroom that, universities are a place to go and have conversations, make mistakes, learn. And I do think about all different subjects played at different parts of your brain. They teach you how to think. Maybe you don't get an A in the class, but it maybe teaches you to think on a higher level. And I just don't know that teaching has gotten around all of that yet.
No, I would agree. I think that the fact of the matter is when I walk into a doctor's office and tell them I'm an organic chemist, oftentimes they tell me how organic chemistry has played zero role in their practice of medicine. But what is true is that perhaps the lessons they learned, problem solving and thinking about organic chemists kind of gave them the tools they need to approach medical problems. And I think the same is true across any kind of discipline. And it could be a political science problem. It could be an economics problem. But, in general, the practice of going after really hard things and problem solving in a logical fashion can be applied in a lot of areas. So I do agree with that.
So can you tell us about what problems that you're looking to solve and about your work and what goes on in your lab at Caltech?
Yeah, so we are really interested in developing technology that'll influence medicine, and so we want to discover new chemicals from nature. They're called natural products that can be used as drugs. It turns out that more than 50% of on-market drugs are derived from nature, a fact that many people don't know. And so we use new electron microscopy and spectroscopy methods to discover those compounds. And we also, we have another division in our lab that works on new chemical reactions or new ways to quote unquote cook drugs or active pharmaceutical ingredients. And a big part of that is AI. So, I think that's something that is important and I guess evidenced by the Nobel Prize in chemistry last week. And this is a big part of science. So our group is largely funded by the National Science Foundation, and we have a center there called the Center for Computer-Aided Chemical Synthesis. And there we use tools in AI to try and help pharmaceutical efforts and biology efforts to think about quicker ways to make molecules that may be drugs or they may be the tools we use to understand fundamental biology.
All right. I hope we haven't lost anybody. But why do we need to do that? Walk us through that next step. Why is that a smart step to take, steps to take, a bridge to cross? Yeah.
So this is, I think, on a couple levels. You can kind of look at it from a lot of perspectives. So, right now, for example, artificial intelligence, as you all know, is just becoming important to all these different elements of society, and that includes science and medicine. And so, we are part of this program, and the impact of what we're doing will effectively, hopefully, allow the preparation of chemicals or the discovery of chemicals for nature to happen quicker. And so, right now, like the therapeutic drug line, if someone makes a discovery that might lead to a drug, it may take a decade to do the work to actually get it into clinical trials, where we think that using artificial intelligence and machine learning and other data science approaches, we're going to be able to shorten that period. So the impact and the importance in medicine and human health is really there. I think you can kind of twist it from the other direction and look at it from the perspective of national security. And so there's a lot of people thinking about, ways that we can protect our country from AI-driven synthesis machines that may be involved in making weapons and doing other things like that. So from all elements of where we're operating, this is really, really important.
That's kind of scary stuff. Hey, we have about a minute left, and then we're going to do some news, and we're going to come back with you, Hosea. But I'm wondering, we talked about the connection doctors have or don't have to organic chemistry. But where else do you see your students going and working when they're done?
Yeah, so most of our students actually go to work in the pharmaceutical industry. So graduate students typically go to work in pharma, big pharma. We have a small section of graduate students that go into consulting. And, undergraduates a lot of times will end up, as you alluded to, in medical school. But these days, a lot of people are using some of the tools they develop in their undergraduate education to be analysts and do other things like that. Go off, work for Google, make devices that tell you about your body and things like that. So it's quite diverse what our students do.
All right, sit tight. We're going to come back and continue, because if you Google Hosea's name, you'll find a lot of stories come up about fungi. So I kind of want to ask him a couple of questions about what we need to know about that, especially as we get ready for another pandemic session or season. We're going to continue with Hosea Nelson over at California Institute of Technology.
4:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Ford Motor Company cut the top end of its full-year earnings forecast. The car maker struggling to cut costs and to overhaul its electric vehicle strategy. Adjusted earnings before interest and taxes this year should be about $10 billion, down from a previous outlook for as much as $12 billion. Ford shares right now down 4.2% in the post-market. Starbucks is telling its corporate staff they could be fired if they don't come to work at the office 3 days a week. Starting in January, Starbucks will implement a standardized process to hold workers accountable if they don't abide by the coffee chain's return to office policy. That's according to a memo sent to one of the company's divisions, seen by Bloomberg News. Former President Donald Trump's social media startup is extending a 5-week surge that pushed the stock up by some 272% from late September. As retail traders tout those shares, the stock jumped as much as 17% earlier today to its highest point since July 15th. Right now, shares of DJT Media gained, we can tell you, 22% in the regular session, 22% for DJT Media. Let's bring you the closing numbers. We do it each day here at Bloomberg. The Dow gained 273 points, NASDAQ up 49, the S&P up 15. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec.
All right. Thank you so much for that update, Amy. Do appreciate that. Let's get right back to Hosea Nelson. He is professor of chemistry at the California Institute of Technology. He runs the Nelson Lab. It's, quote, a multidisciplinary research group focused on developing next-gen tools for organic chemistry. Hosea is joining us from Pasadena, California. We also got Janet Lauren, Bloomberg News higher education finance reporter here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio.
Hosea was also the winner of the 2022 Blavatnik National Awards for Young Scientists. They intend to, and this is I'm reading from what they say, to recognize and celebrate exceptional young scientists in the life sciences, physical sciences, and engineering and chemistry, and to provide critical support to send innovative work in science and technology that will address society's most pressing global problems. All right, Hosea, before we went to a break, I said, Google your name, and you're going to come up with a bunch of stories about fungi. Tell us about fungal pathogens, the work you are doing, and why we need to kind of sit up and take notice.
Yeah, that's a popular question. The Last of Us made us famous, actually.
Really?
But yeah, I think so. You know,
cool.
I think that television shows, they kind of sometimes bring some truth to the reality of their viewers. And so the truth of the matter is, and this is something we talk a lot about in our research group, is that if the next pandemic was a fungal pandemic instead of a viral pandemic, we wouldn't have things off the shelf ready to go. We wouldn't have therapeutics. We would not have vaccine technology, and you know, fighting our way out of that pandemic would be a lot more difficult. And the reason is, at least from my perspective, is that fungi are genetically very similar to human beings. It turns out that there's around 50% overlap between our genes. And so when we make drugs to kill fungi, a lot of times there's off-target effects that are basically side effects to the human beings taking them. And so one of the things we do in the group is that we look for the mechanisms that fungi use in warfare against other fungi, and use the tools that they've developed through evolution to develop the next generation of fungal therapeutics. And so fungi have gotten pretty good at killing each other without themselves. And so that's the lesson we learned from them. And that's historically a lot of the way drugs are developed. If you think about penicillin, that came from the discovery that a particular fungi on a petri dish stopped bacteria from growing. And so the fungi made antibacterial agents. And we now know that those are antibiotics, and we prescribe them all the time. So we take a similar approach, but we focus a lot on fungi to kill fungi. It's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, totally. It kind of makes sense. Well, I just think it's interesting because we talked to Dr. Sharfstein from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health earlier.
Viruses,
right.
Public health.
About viruses and public health and the importance of it, and, you know, how it saves all of our lives. And I just wonder, you know, is it one of those things that is not getting the attention that maybe it needs to? And I don't know how you see it. Like when you talk about it with you know, public health officials, I don't know, like, what are you hearing? What are you seeing?
I think this is my conjecture. I think that human beings in society are really good to responding to emergencies, but preparing for emergencies are something I don't think we do as well. And so I think in the community, we've all known for a while that we don't have off-the-shelf treatments or treatment strategies for fungi in general. And, I think, to be honest, that, until we have that imminent threat, I'm concerned that we're not going to do enough. And so when I talk about it, I think from a scientific perspective, people acknowledge its truth, but yet you don't really see that much investment in those technologies. Now that said, I'm part of a fairly large group of scientists that's funded by Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and we are looking specifically at this problem, but I don't think it's enough. I think that there needs to be an effort federally from the NIH. That's my position and take on this issue.
So you mentioned NIH, and we're always interested in funding, especially government funding of science. Is there a concern that there may not be the same kind of funding scope in terms of where scientific research money is coming from?
There's a tremendous concern. So to bring some facts, in 1998, the National Institutes of Health established a modular budgetary system. So, when you write a proposal to the NIH asking for research money, you can kind of, do it an itemized way, or you could just ask for a standard budget. That standard budget was $250,000 in 1998, and it is $250,000 in 2024. And so what this means is the research funding that used to support the training of 8 scientists or so now, will support 2.5 scientists. And so the number of people and workforce that we're training and putting towards solving these really incredibly important problems in human health is dramatically reduced. And so there is obviously a funding issue out there, and it's concerning. I think the other part of it is traditionally there's been a significant amount of investment from the private sector, in particular from pharmaceutical companies, into the type of research we do. And I know that since 2008, the financial crisis at that point slowed that down, and it hasn't quite recovered. So now we're in this situation where the people that actually fuel pharmaceutical innovation and that whole industry are trained by research groups that are underfunded by both the pharmaceutical industry and the government. And so I don't know when this is going to catch up and when this is going to really be borne out in terms of how much pharmaceutical innovation we can make, but it's certainly a looming problem from my perspective.
So where else would universities like Caltech or MIT or Harvard look for research foundation if perhaps the government and industry are curbing those numbers, or they're not going as far as they used to?
I think this ties into education. From my perspective, is that, I think we need to do a better job educating on the undergraduate chemistry level for a couple of reasons. Number one is that's going to, continue a nice flow of tuition, right? I mean, things are getting really expensive, but tuition also goes and contributes to this research environment. Private donors, so people that go off and are successful and do well, hopefully will look back at their chemistry courses, and instead of, having PTSD, will look back favorably on what they learned there and hopefully make donations moving forward. And finally, I think education is super important so that the next round of policymakers will have had a favorable experience, undergraduate experience. And so I think, we can look towards donors and philanthropy for money, and that's great. But I still think ultimately the path towards sustainability and scientific sustainability and competitiveness with the rest of the world is going to rely on influencing policy.
Okay, we only have about 40 seconds left. It's not a ton of time for my last question, but Professor, is there something that keeps you up at night out there?
Like a fungi that's just going to wreak havoc.
Your Last of Us comment got me thinking.
I know.
Yeah, I think there's not a particular fungi, and actually, I'm up a lot at night thinking about viruses too. I think that SARS-2, that was a very deadly disease. I think it was a 30% or some double-digit percentage fatality. It just wasn't as infectious as COVID or SARS-3. And so, any disease that has this the potential as a contagion and and is much more lethal, I think could have a much greater effect on society. And I'm afraid that we're, going to be complacent because we made it out of COVID, relatively intact as a society. And so
I feel like we've had a theme around this today, and I think about this, our conversation with you and an earlier guest, Jose Nelson, professor of chemistry at California Institute of Technology, and our own Janet Lauren of Bloomberg News. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Ford shares under pressure right now, down 5% after the company lowered its profit expectation under pressure from EV losses. We've got Bloomberg News senior editor Chester Dawson with us, joining us from our Detroit bureau. Chester, give us the numbers here that have investors so concerned about Ford.
Well, it's mostly about the outlook. They actually, met the expectation for the third quarter, but of course that's back-looking, and most investors are interested in what's going to be happening for the balance of the year. And that's where the problem is. They trimmed the top end of their forecast. They had been saying they make as much as $12 billion this year in adjusted earnings before interest and taxes, and now that's down to about $10 billion. So that $2 billion reduction at the top end of the forecast is what seems to be hitting the market hardest.
So is this a case of Ford not guiding the street well, or that all of a sudden things are worse than maybe Ford expected?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, we'll hear from management from the top of the hour when they have a conference call. But they have been dealing with a number of issues, from the losses in their EVs, which only seem to have gone from bad to worse, to issues with things like warranties on their gas-fueled cars that have been troubling them for years and also don't seem to have been going away in the most recent quarter. So the CFO, was talking to reporters now and has highlighted a few things like some supply chain issues, inflationary woes that are enduring, and even apparently some hurricane-related issues. But at the end of the day, it's those fundamental issues that have dogged their auto business that seem to be what has their stock taken a few rounds to the sensitive parts in the body.
Well said. Well said. Is that the main difference between what we heard from GM last week? They raised their 2024 profit projection for the third time this year. What's working for GM that's not working for Ford?
That's a great question. GM has kind of turned into a profit-making machine, and they're giving a lot back of that cash in the form of buybacks, which of course investors love. They basically have right-sized their EV business and are ramping up production and are able to have kind of met their objectives. And obviously a lot remains to be seen about how well those EVs will sell into next year. But so far they've been able to, do what they said they would in terms of, fixing what issues they had with their EV batteries, ramping up production. But more importantly, they're hitting out of the park with the sales of their larger SUVs and trucks, and they don't have warranty issues like Ford does. So all that money's going straight to the bank at GM, whereas at Ford, they're kind of tying themselves up into knots trying to get issues with their core meat and potato internal combustion engine business on the right track.
Chester, I keep going back. I was looking at the story from June where Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, came out and said he's so fed up with being the most recalled automaker in America that he's willing to lose money to fix what's ballooned into a $4.8 billion a year problem. I mean, this is a big problem, these QC issues. Is there any end in sight?
Well, I mean, the good news is, as you say, it's been identified at a very high level. Jim Farley has kind of made this, pardon the pun, job one. But, this is also a problem that's dogged them for years. It's not a new thing. And, they have said they're going to tear things apart and figure out what the issue is to try to stench these recurring losses. But, they haven't had much success so far. But, management has highlighted it as a top priority. And if they can't, it may impact the tenure of Jim Farley and crew because it is such a terrible problem.
Why did they have such an issue with this?
Well, I think, if they knew, they would, have already fixed
That's
it.
true.
I'm not exactly sure. It may have something to do with, rushing vehicles to market or, some, other factory floor related issue that other automakers, haven't experienced. It is a little puzzling. And, in some cases, I can recall a specific